Every empire has a man who holds the knife at its throat. In the frozen territories north of the capital, that man was Duke Cedric Veramont. They called him the Iron Duke, though never within his hearing, because the last nobleman who used the title to his face lost 3 generations of land rights before the next sunrise. Cedric did not punish people with violence. He punished them with precision. But on the night the snow buried Blackmere Keep beneath white silence, the most powerful man in the Northern Empire made the one mistake that precision could never correct. He locked his pregnant wife in the cold, and he let another woman sleep in her bed. What happened next changed everything. Stay until the end of this one. Snow came down hard and mean against the black iron towers of Blackmere Keep, the kind of storm that buried livestock and cracked stone walls if left unchecked for more than 2 days. Inside the ancestral fortress, firelight threw long golden shadows across marble corridors and silk curtains imported from empires most servants would never see in their lifetimes. Crystal chandeliers shivered on their chains each time the wind slammed against the outer walls. The whole castle smelled of burning cedar, old wine, and something else. Something rotten beneath the luxury that nobody could name but everyone could feel crawling through the hallways like a sickness nobody wanted to diagnose. Cedric Veramont stood alone in the war chamber on the 3rd floor, staring into the fire with both hands pressed flat against the stone mantel. The flames reflected in his dark eyes, turning them into something that looked less like a man thinking and more like a man deciding who deserved to suffer next. He was 34 years old, 6 feet 2 inches of muscle built across border campaigns, diplomatic sieges, and the kind of backroom negotiations that left weaker men sweating through their shirts before the first course arrived at dinner. His jaw carried a scar from a cavalry sword that caught him during the Ashenmore Rebellion 3 years earlier. He wore it the way other men wore medals, not with pride, with warning. The door behind him opened without a knock. "The courtyard detail confirms she's still standing," Captain Cassian Vale said from the threshold. His voice carried the flat tone of a soldier delivering information he wished he did not possess. Cedric did not turn around. "Standing or sitting makes no difference." "She's barefoot, Your Grace." "She was barefoot when she tried to poison me 3 nights ago. At least now her feet match her loyalty." Cassian hesitated at the door. He was a broad man with weather-beaten skin and hands that had broken bones on 3 different battlefields for the Veramont name. Loyalty ran through him like iron ore through mountain rock. But loyalty was not the same thing as blindness, and what he had seen in that courtyard 20 minutes ago scraped against something inside him that no amount of military discipline could file smooth. "The physicians say the cold could endanger the child." Cedric finally turned his head. Not all the way. Just enough to pin Cassian with a look that had preceded the destruction of men far more powerful than a guard captain. "The child is mine. The woman carrying it conspired against my life. If you have a problem reconciling those 2 facts, Captain, I suggest you find a posting that requires less thinking." Cassian swallowed whatever response had started climbing his throat. He nodded once and stepped back through the door, pulling it shut behind him with the careful precision of a man who understood that the line between trusted commander and executed traitor was thinner than candlelight in Cedric Veramont's world. Alone again, Cedric poured himself a glass of wine from the decanter on his desk. His hand was steady. It was always steady. Even during the night 3 days prior, when the royal physician had pulled him aside during a council banquet and told him that traces of black venom had been found in his wine goblet. Even when guards had discovered the vial hidden inside Seraphina's private writing desk. Even when a chamber servant had testified, shaking so violently her words came out in fragments, that the Duchess had bribed her to deliver correspondence to an unnamed contact outside the fortress. Cedric had listened to every piece of evidence with the same expression he wore during military tribunals. Stone. Absolute. Certain. He condemned his wife before the sun touched the eastern towers. Because Cedric Veramont had survived assassination attempts before, he had survived poisoned letters, rigged hunting expeditions, and one spectacularly bold plot involving a collapsing bridge during a state procession. Each time, the perpetrator was someone he had trusted. A cousin. A minister. A boyhood friend who smiled at him across banquet tables for 15 years while quietly selling military intelligence to southern lords. Trust was the most expensive currency in the empire, and Kaedric had stopped paying it years ago. Even for his wife. Especially for his wife. He drained the wine and set the glass down with a sound like a gavel striking wood. Then he climbed the stone stairs toward the master chamber, where firelight glowed beneath the heavy oak door and the scent of jasmine and imported silk drifted through the cracks. Lady Evelise Arden waited inside. She sat in the chair nearest the fire, wearing a deep burgundy gown that caught the light in ways that made the fabric look liquid. Her dark hair fell across one shoulder in a deliberate arrangement that suggested both carelessness and careful planning. She was 28, sharp-featured, with the kind of beauty that worked like a blade. You noticed it immediately. Then you noticed the cut. "You look tired," she said, pouring wine from a crystal decanter that had appeared in the chamber the same night Serafina disappeared from it. "I look like a man whose wife tried to kill him." "Former wife," Evelise corrected gently. "She's still my wife. The child she carries makes certain of that." Evelise's smile did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted. A recalculation so fast and smooth that only someone who had spent years reading faces across negotiation tables would have caught it. Kaedric caught nothing. Because Kaedric was looking at the fire, not at the woman sitting beside it. "A child born to a traitor carries complicated inheritance," Evelise said, crossing her legs beneath the silk. "The Northern Council will have questions about succession. I can help you navigate those waters, if you allow me." "You're already navigating them, Evelise. You've been navigating them since you arrived at Blackmere 6 months ago." She tilted her head. "Is that an accusation?" "It's an observation. I deal in observations. Accusations require evidence." "And you had evidence against Serafina." Kaedric said nothing. The fire cracked. Somewhere below the floorboards, snow collapsed against the eastern wall with a sound like distant thunder. Evelise rose from her chair and walked toward him with the kind of controlled grace that took years of aristocratic training to perfect. She placed her hand on his forearm, just below the rolled sleeve, where the firelight exposed the veins and tendons that carried the weight of an empire every single day. "You did the right thing," she whispered. "A duke who cannot punish betrayal cannot protect his domain. The people need to see strength. Mercy toward a poisoner is weakness dressed in compassion, and weakness invites the next assassin through the door." Kaedric looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face, then at the bed behind her where silk sheets had been turned down and arranged with the kind of intimate precision that servants reserved for the master of the house and his chosen companion. "I did not invite you into this chamber tonight," he said. "You did not need to." The door was open. She held his gaze with absolute calm. No flinching, no submission. Just steady, intelligent confidence that met his authority without challenging it directly. Most people flinched around Kaedric Veramont. Evelise Arden never flinched. And somehow, in the ruins of everything he thought he understood about loyalty and love and the woman who carried his child in the freezing courtyard below, that steadiness felt like exactly what he needed. He sat down on the edge of the bed. Evelise poured another glass of wine and handed it to him. And 3 floors below, in the frozen courtyard where guards stood with their eyes locked forward like statues, Duchess Serafina Veramont pressed both hands against her swollen stomach and watched the golden light of the master bedroom windows glow through the storm. She was shaking, not just from cold, from the kind of rage that starts deep in the bones and works its way outward through the blood until every cell in the body vibrates with a frequency that feels like it could crack stone. 6 months earlier, Serafina had stood in this same courtyard during summer twilight, watching fireflies drift through the garden hedges while Kaedric walked beside her. He had placed his hand on her stomach the night she told him about the pregnancy. He had said nothing for a long time. Then he kissed her forehead with a tenderness that felt foreign on a man built entirely from war and suspicion. She remembered the smell of leather and cedar on his skin. She remembered thinking that somewhere beneath the Iron Duke existed a man capable of something softer than dominance. She had been wrong. Or maybe she had been right, and the man capable of softness had been murdered by the same paranoia that now kept her barefoot in a snowstorm while another woman warmed herself beside his fire. Serafina knew the poison accusation was fabricated. She knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat. Because 3 days before the council banquet, she had seen Evelise's personal servant leaving the east corridor near Serafina's private chambers. The woman had carried a small leather pouch and moved with the hurried steps of someone completing a task she did not want witnessed. Serafina had mentioned it to no one, because in Blackmere Keep, information was not something you shared. It was something you survived long enough to use. The wind tore through the courtyard archways and slammed against her back. Snow clung to her nightdress and melted against her skin, sending cold trails down her spine that made her jaw clench hard enough to crack teeth. The baby moved inside her, a slow, deliberate shift that felt like a reminder that she was not the only life depending on what she did next. "Duchess?" The voice came from behind the stone pillar near the eastern gate. Serafina did not turn immediately. She waited. 3 heartbeats. Then 4. Because in a fortress full of spies, even friendly voices could carry daggers. Cassian Vale stepped from behind the pillar, carrying a wool blanket folded beneath his arm. His face looked carved from granite, all hard angles and clenched jaw, the way soldiers looked when they disagreed with an order but lacked the rank to refuse it. "You should not be standing," he said. "Your duke seems to disagree." "My duke is making decisions I cannot explain. That does not change the fact that hypothermia kills faster than any political accusation." He held the blanket toward her. Serafina stared at it. "If he sees you giving me that, you lose your position, possibly your head. If I watch a pregnant woman freeze to death and do nothing, I lose something worse." Serafina took the blanket. She wrapped it around her shoulders without gratitude, without warmth, without any of the aristocratic politeness that court life demanded from women in her position. She wrapped it like a soldier wrapping a wound, because that is exactly what it was. "How long have you served him?" she asked. 11 years. "In 11 years, has he ever been wrong about someone?" Cassian was quiet for a moment. The snow settled on his shoulders like white ash. "Once, a minister named Barend, the Duke accused him of selling military intelligence, had him stripped of title, wealth, everything. 2 years later, evidence surfaced proving Barend was innocent. The real traitor was Barend's own secretary." "What did Cedric do when he learned the truth?" Cassian's jaw tightened. He never spoke of it again. "Did he restore Barend's name?" Barend had already died. Prison fever. 6 months after sentencing. Serafina nodded slowly. The information settled inside her chest like a stone dropped into dark water. Not because it surprised her, but because it confirmed what she had suspected since the night Cedric condemned her without allowing a single word of defense. The Iron Duke did not make mistakes. He made decisions. And when those decisions destroyed innocent people, he buried the evidence beneath silence and moved forward, because looking backward required a kind of emotional courage that Cedric Vermont had amputated from himself long before she ever entered his life. She pulled the blanket tighter. "I need access to the treasury archives beneath the wine cellars." Cassian blinked. "That section has been sealed since last winter." "I know what has been sealed. I also know what Evelise Arden has been hiding inside those archives since the day she arrived at Blackmere. Duchess, if you are caught attempting to access restricted areas while under formal accusation, the Duke will not confine you to a courtyard. He will transfer you to the Northern Garrison prison. No physician access. No visitors. You would deliver that child on a stone floor surrounded by convicted criminals. Then I will not get caught." Cassian stared at her for a long moment. The storm screamed through the courtyard around them, blasting snow horizontally between the pillars and rattling the iron gate chains like bones shaking in a grave. "You are asking me to commit treason," he said. "I am asking you to choose between loyalty to a title and loyalty to the truth. Your Duke does not know the difference anymore. Maybe he never did." The words hung in the frozen air between them. Cassian's hand rested on the pommel of his sword, not threateningly, reflexively, the way a man grips something solid when the ground beneath him starts cracking. He thought about Barend, about the minister who rotted in prison for a crime he did not commit, while the Iron Duke buried the injustice beneath protocol and moved on to the next campaign. He thought about the woman standing before him in a snow-covered nightdress, pregnant with the heir to the most powerful house in the Northern Empire, asking him to risk everything because she believed the truth still mattered in a world that had clearly decided it did not. 3 nights from now, Cassian said quietly, During the diplomatic reception, the Duke will be occupied with the southern delegation in the Great Hall. Guards rotate at the cellar entrance every 45 minutes. I can give you 30. Serafina held his eyes. 30 is enough. If this goes wrong, Duchess, I cannot protect you. If this goes wrong, Captain, there will be nothing left worth protecting. 3 days passed beneath a sky that looked like bruised iron. Blackmere Keep transformed for the diplomatic reception. Servants scrubbed marble floors until they reflected candlelight like dark water. Kitchen staff prepared feasts that could feed entire villages. Musicians rehearsed in the grand ballroom while the smell of roasted game and spiced wine drifted through every corridor. Above it all, Evelise moved through the castle like smoke through a burning building, quiet, everywhere, impossible to grasp. Serafina watched from her confined chamber in the eastern tower. The room smelled of damp stone and old ash, nothing like the lavender and cedar that once scented the master suite she had shared with Cadric. Frost traced patterns on the single narrow window. Through it she could see the courtyard below, the grand entrance beyond the walls, and the carriages arriving from the south carrying diplomats, ministers, and noble families whose loyalty shifted with the wind. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and felt the baby kick. Hard. Twice. Like a fist pounding against a door that would not open. I know, she whispered. I know. That evening, while the reception thundered through the great hall below, Serafina moved. Cassian had left a servant's cloak folded inside the chamber's unused coal storage. Plain gray wool, no markings. The kind of garment that made a person invisible in a castle full of hundreds of working staff. Serafina pulled it over her shoulders, tucked her hair beneath the hood, and slipped through the eastern tower's maintenance stairwell. The steps were narrow, uneven, and smelled of mildew and old stone. Her bare feet touched each one carefully. No sound, no hesitation. She reached the ground floor corridor and paused. Ahead, the underground wine tunnels stretched beneath Blackmere like the veins of some massive sleeping creature. Torchlight flickered at irregular intervals along the walls, throwing long shadows that jumped and twisted with each draft. Serafina moved through the tunnels with a precision that would have surprised anyone who still thought of her as a delicate, aristocratic wife. Before marrying Cadric, she had spent 2 years managing the grain distribution networks across 3 northern provinces. She knew logistics, she knew supply chains. She knew that every fortress in the empire kept its most dangerous secrets in the one place powerful men believed no one would ever think to look. Not in vaults, not in guarded chambers. In the records no one bothered reading. The Treasury Archives section was exactly where Cassian described it. A heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands, sealed with a lock that looked formidable, but was, in reality, a standard Blackmere household mechanism that Serafina had used dozens of times during her first year managing the castle's domestic accounts. She picked it in 11 seconds. Inside, the archive room stretched 30 feet in every direction, floor to ceiling with wooden shelving packed tight with leather-bound ledgers, rolled documents, wax-sealed correspondence, and financial records dating back 3 generations of Veramont rule. Serafina did not search randomly. She went directly to the shelving section marked with the administrative codes Evelise's household staff had been using since their arrival. Codes that matched no standard Blackmere filing system. Codes that Serafina had quietly memorized during the weeks when Evelise thought the Duchess was too consumed with pregnancy discomfort to notice anything beyond her own chambers. She pulled the first ledger, then the second, then a bundle of correspondence bound with dark ribbon and sealed with a crest she did not recognize. What she found inside made her hands stop moving. Treasury records showing systematic drainage of northern provincial revenues over 3 years. Military contracts redirecting weapons shipments away from Veramont garrisons and toward border outposts controlled by noble families aligned with Evelise's bloodline. Trade agreements deliberately engineering grain shortages in territories loyal to Cadric, forcing those communities into debt arrangements with Arden-controlled merchant guilds. And at the bottom of the stack, beneath everything else, a single letter written in Evelise's own hand. The language was careful, coded, but the meaning bled through the diplomatic phrasing like a wound that could not be bandaged. Evelise was not simply seducing the Duke of Veramont. She was dismantling his empire from inside his own fortress. Every manipulated trade route, every redirected military supply, Every fabricated shortage served a single purpose: force Kaedric into armed conflict with the Southern Territories, drain his military reserves, destabilize his alliances. Then, when House Veramont was too weakened to resist, replace Kaedric through a combination of political marriage and manufactured legal claims to succession. Serafina was never the real target of the poison accusation. Removing her was simply the first move. Isolate the Duke from the one person who understood his domain's domestic infrastructure. Strip away the human connection that might have given him perspective. Leave him alone with nothing but his paranoia and a woman whispering exactly what that paranoia wanted to hear. Kaedric was the target. He had always been the target, and he was too blinded by his own need for control to see the walls closing around him. Serafina gathered the documents and pressed them against her chest beneath the servant's cloak. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The baby shifted inside her, pressing against her ribs as if sensing the tension flooding through her bloodstream. She turned toward the archive door and froze. Voices. Coming from the tunnel beyond the entrance. Not servants. The footsteps carried the heavy, measured cadence of armed guards. Steel clinked against leather with each stride. Serafina pulled back into the shadows between two tall shelving units. Her breathing was too loud. She pressed one hand over her mouth and the other against her stomach, willing the child inside her to stay still, stay quiet, stay alive. The voices grew louder. 2 guards. No, 3. Speaking in low tones about the reception upstairs, about the Southern diplomats, about the Duke's mood tonight. Then a 4th voice. Deeper, colder, familiar in a way that made every muscle in Serafina's body lock rigid. I want every tunnel entrance sealed after midnight. No exceptions. The Eastern Tower access point receives a permanent guard detail starting tomorrow. If anyone has been moving through these passages without authorization, I want to know about it before sunrise. Kaedric. Serafina closed her eyes. The documents pressed against her chest felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. 30 seconds. Maybe less. The footsteps would pass the archive door if the lock showed any sign of tampering, if the door sat even slightly ajar, if one guard glanced sideways at the wrong moment. The footsteps reached the archive door, paused. "This section is still sealed?" Kaedric asked. "Yes, Your Grace. No access reported since last winter." A beat of silence that stretched across Serafina's entire existence. "Fine. Move on." The footsteps continued, faded, disappeared around the tunnel's far corner like a storm passing over a battlefield. Serafina exhaled. The air came out shaking, broken, tasting like copper and fear. She waited 4 full minutes before moving. Then she slipped through the archive door, relocked it behind her, and navigated the tunnels back toward the Eastern Tower stairwell with the documents hidden beneath her cloak and her pulse pounding against the evidence that could either save the Veramont Empire or burn it to the ground. She reached the stairwell entrance and found Cassian waiting in the shadows, his hand on his sword hilt, his face drained of color. "We need to move. Now," he said. The rotation changed. Someone pulled 2 additional guards for the eastern wing. This was not scheduled. "Evelise?" "I do not know, but someone is watching movements in this section of the castle, and whoever it is, they are not operating on standard guard protocols." Serafina gripped the documents tighter. "I found everything: treasury records, military contracts, correspondence in her own handwriting. Cassian, she's not just manipulating him, she is engineering a civil war. The entire Northern Territory is being dismantled from inside these walls." Cassian stared at her. The information hit his face like a physical blow. Not surprise exactly. More like the sickening confirmation of something he had felt in his gut for months but never allowed himself to name out loud. "We need to reach the Duke," he said. "The Duke condemned me without evidence and locked me in a courtyard during a snowstorm while I carry his heir. He will not listen to me. Then we bring these documents to someone who will." "Who?" "Every minister in this castle has been replaced by Evelise's people. Every servant is being watched. Every communication leaving Blackmere passes through channels she controls. There is no one left inside these walls who is not already compromised." Cassian's hand tightened on his sword. The muscles in his jaw worked beneath the skin like machinery grinding against itself. "Then we go outside the walls." Serafina looked at him. The torchlight carved deep shadows across his face, turning the loyal soldier into something that looked less like a commander and more like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, calculating whether the fall would kill him or just break everything that mattered. "If we leave the castle together," she said quietly, "he will call it treason. He will call it betrayal. He will look at his most trusted captain and his pregnant wife fleeing Blackmere in the middle of a diplomatic reception, and he will not see evidence of conspiracy. He will see confirmation of everything Evelise has been whispering into his ear since the night she climbed into his bed. I know. He will destroy you, Cassian. Everything you have built, your rank, your family's name, your life. I know that too." Silence settled between them, heavy and final and shaped like a door that only opened in one direction. Cassian reached into his belt and pulled a folded document bearing a military transit seal. "I requisition passage through the northern gate under Supply Transport Authority. 2 horses. Provisions for 3 days. If we move before the final reception toast, we have a 40-minute window before anyone checks the eastern tower." Serafina took the transit document. Her fingers brushed his, and she noticed they were trembling. Not hers. His. The most decorated captain in the Vermont Guard was shaking because he understood exactly what he was about to sacrifice. "Why?" she asked. Cassian met her eyes. "Because 11 years ago, a minister named Berend was innocent, and I stood in formation while the Duke sentenced him to die. I watched it happen. I said nothing, and I have carried that silence like a stone in my chest every single day since." His voice dropped. "Not again." They moved through the lower corridors toward the northern gate. Serafina walked with one arm cradling her stomach and the other pressing the stolen documents against her ribs. The servant cloak billowed behind her. Snow blew through the cracks in the gate's iron frame, dusting the corridor floor with white powder that crunched beneath their boots. They were 15 steps from the gate when the alarm bells erupted. The sound tore through Blackmere like an explosion, shattering the reception's music, drowning the diplomats' conversations, sending servants scrambling against walls while guards drew swords and formed defensive positions across every major corridor. Cassian grabbed Serafina's arm. "Go, now, do not stop." They ran, through the gate, across the outer courtyard, toward the stables where 2 horses stood saddled beneath the frozen overhang, their breath rising in white clouds against the storm. Serafina mounted the first horse with a grace that defied her condition. Cassian swung onto the second and kicked hard. The animals surged forward through the castle's northern perimeter, hooves cracking against ice-covered stone, snow whipping past in horizontal sheets. Behind them, torchlight flooded the outer walls. Shouts ricocheted between the towers. The alarm bells screamed without stopping, their iron voices carrying across the frozen landscape like a declaration of war. They cleared the outer wall. They hit the northern road. For 30 seconds, Serafina believed they would make it. Then she looked back, and her blood turned to ice colder than anything the storm could produce. Because standing on the castle's highest rampart, silhouetted against the firelight pouring from every window of Blackmere Keep, was Kedrick Vermont. Watching, not moving, not shouting orders, not sending cavalry, just watching his pregnant wife ride into the storm beside his most trusted captain. And even across the distance, even through the blinding snow and the howling wind, and the darkness pressing against her from every direction, Serafina could see his face. Not the cold calculation she expected, not the controlled fury of a duke whose authority had been challenged. Something worse, something she had never seen cross that face in all the years she had known him. Hatred, pure, absolute, bottomless. The kind of hatred that does not seek punishment, it seeks annihilation. Kedrick turned from the rampart and disappeared into the fortress. And Serafina knew with the certainty of a woman who had studied this man's every gesture, every silence, every controlled breath across years of marriage and political survival, that what was coming next would not be justice. It would not be pursuit. It would be war. Kedrick Vermont did not sleep that night. He stood in the war chamber with every candle burning and every map of the northern territories spread across the oak table like the skin of a dead empire. His hands pressed flat against the parchment. His breathing came slow and controlled, the way it always did before he made the kind of decision that left permanent marks on the world around him. Serafina was gone. Cassian was gone. And the only thought moving through his skull with any clarity was not grief or confusion or the kind of wounded disbelief that might have visited a lesser man. It was something older, something that lived in the basement of his mind where the architecture of his personality had been poured into iron molds during a childhood spent watching his father execute rivals at the dinner table. They chose to run. That meant they had something to hide. That meant the poison accusation was not fabricated. That meant every instinct that had driven him to condemn Serafina 3 nights ago was correct. And the woman carrying his heir had been conspiring with his most trusted military officer to destroy the Veramont name from inside his own fortress. The logic was clean. The logic was wrong. But Kaedric Veramont had built an entire empire on the principle that certainty was more valuable than truth, because truth required patience and vulnerability and the willingness to admit that the picture inside your head might not match the world outside your walls. Certainty required nothing except the power to enforce it. He had plenty of that. "Marshal Corvin," he said without turning from the maps. The door opened. A tall man with silver-streaked hair and the permanently tensed posture of a career military officer stepped inside. Marshal Darius Corvin had served House Veramont for 23 years, outlasting 3 political purges and 2 assassination campaigns through a simple philosophy: do exactly what the Duke says, ask nothing, remember everything. "Your Grace." "Full cavalry mobilization along the northern corridor. 12 units. I want every village checkpoint, every supply post, every bridge crossing within 100 miles of Blackmere under surveillance before dawn." Corvin did not blink. "Rules of engagement." Kaedric finally looked up from the maps. The firelight caught the scar along his jaw and turned it into a dark line that looked like a crack running through stone. "Bring back the woman alive. The child she carries belongs to this house." "And Captain Vale?" The silence that followed contained more violence than any spoken command could have carried. Kedric's eyes did not change. His breathing did not shift. But something in the room altered, the way air changes pressure before a storm wall hits the coast. "Cassian Vale ceased being a captain the moment he rode through my gate with my wife. He is a deserter, a traitor, and a thief who stole the future of the Veramont dynasty." "Dead or alive, then?" "I did not say alive." Corvin nodded once and left the chamber. His boots echoed down the corridor with the steady rhythm of machinery being set into motion, the kind of motion that could not be reversed once it began. Alone again, Kaedric walked to the window and stared out at the storm-battered northern landscape. Snow covered everything: the fields, the roads, the distant tree line where the forest began its dark sprawl toward the mountains. Somewhere out there, in that frozen white emptiness, the woman who had shared his bed for 3 years was running from him with evidence he did not know existed, and a child he had already claimed as property of his bloodline. His reflection stared back at him from the frost-covered glass. Gaunt, hard, the face of a man who had eliminated every soft edge from his existence because softness invited exploitation, and exploitation invited death. His father had taught him that. Not through words, through demonstration. Through the systematic destruction of every person who ever mistook the Elder Duke's occasional kindness for permanent vulnerability. Kaedric had watched his mother leave this same castle when he was 9 years old. She had not fled. She had simply walked out the front gate one winter morning carrying nothing except the dress on her back and a look on her face that Kaedric would spend 25 years trying to name. His father never pursued her, never mentioned her again. When servants asked, the Elder Duke would say she had become inconvenient, as if describing a horse that could no longer carry its rider. Kaedric pressed his forehead against the cold glass and closed his eyes. Something behind his ribs tightened. Not emotion. Something mechanical. Something structural. The internal support beams of a man who had replaced feeling with function so completely that the original architecture no longer existed. He told himself the tightness was anger. It was not anger. But admitting what it actually was would have required dismantling the only version of himself that had ever survived the world he was born into, and Kaedric Veramont was not ready for demolition. Not yet. 40 miles north, Serafina and Cassian pushed through the storm on horses that were beginning to falter. The animals' legs shook with each stride through snow that reached past their knees in places. Wind drove ice crystals into every exposed surface of skin. turning the world into a white assault that obliterated sight, sound, and any sense of direction beyond forward. Serafina rode with one arm wrapped across her stomach, and the other gripping the reins with fingers that had stopped feeling anything 2 hours ago. The baby pressed against her spine with steady, rhythmic movements that felt less like comfort and more like a countdown. Cassian pulled alongside her and shouted over the wind. "There is a monastery village 3 miles east, stone walls, defensible position. We can rest the horses and send word to the southern provinces. The southern provinces are preparing their own rebellion. Any message we send will be intercepted by lords looking for leverage against Blackmere." "Then where?" Serafina squinted through the snow. The landscape ahead was nothing but white violence stretching toward a horizon that did not exist. Every direction looked the same. Every direction felt like a trap. "The coastal garrison at Ashenmere. Commander Braddock served under my father's house before the territorial consolidation. He has no loyalty to Vermont, but he despises political corruption more than he fears the Duke. If we can reach him with these documents, he has the military credibility to bring the evidence before the Imperial Council. Ashenmere is a 6-day ride in clear weather. In this storm, with horses already failing, we are looking at 8, possibly 9. "Then we ride for 9 days. Cassian looked at her. The wind tore at his cloak and plastered snow across his beard. His eyes carried the flat, exhausted calculation of a soldier who understood exactly how many variables stood between their current position and survival, and who had decided that counting those variables no longer served any useful purpose. "You are 7 months pregnant, Duchess." "I am aware of my own body, Captain. I am saying that 8 days of hard riding through winter storms could kill you, both of you." Serafina turned to face him. The snow whipped between them. Her face was raw from cold, her lips cracked, her eyes burning with the kind of intensity that came not from courage but from the total elimination of every other option. "Cadric will send cavalry, 12 units at minimum, probably more, because the Iron Duke does not do anything at minimum. They will cover every major road, every checkpoint, every village within 100 miles. If we stop moving, we die. If we turn back, we die. If I deliver this child on a frozen road in the middle of nowhere with nothing but a soldier and 2 exhausted horses, then that is what happens. But I will not let that woman sit in my home, sleep in my bed, and dismantle my husband's empire while he is too consumed by his own need to control everything to see that he is the one being controlled." The word husband came out of her mouth before she could stop it. She heard it hang in the frozen air and felt something crack behind her sternum. Not because she still loved Cadric. The question of love had become irrelevant somewhere between the courtyard and the northern gate, but because the word carried weight. History. 3 years of shared nights and careful negotiations, and the slow, patient work of trying to build something human inside a fortress built entirely for war. She had failed. Maybe the project was impossible from the beginning. Maybe you could not build warmth inside a man who had been manufactured for coldness the way weapons are manufactured for destruction. Not because the raw material was wrong, but because the forging process had been so complete that nothing remained of whatever softer metal existed before the hammering began. Cassian watched her face cycle through something he recognized but could not name. Then he turned his horse eastward and kicked hard. 6 days, he said over his shoulder. "We cut through the Ashenmere forest instead of following the road. It adds terrain difficulty but eliminates every checkpoint between here and the coast. The Duke's cavalry cannot mobilize through that kind of tree cover. The forest is unmapped past the first 20 miles. Then we map it ourselves." They rode east. The storm swallowed them whole. Back at Blackmere Keep, Evelise Arden stood in the great hall as the last of the diplomatic guests departed through the main gate. She wore emerald silk that caught the chandelier light in ways that made the fabric shimmer like something alive, something that breathed and shifted with each movement of her body. The gown had belonged to Serafina. Evelise had found it in the Duchess's wardrobe the morning after the condemnation and had it altered by palace seamstresses before the evening banquet. Nobody commented on the dress. Everyone noticed. That was the point. Evelise understood power the way surgeons understand anatomy, not as an abstract concept, but as a living system with specific pressure points, blood supplies, and vulnerabilities that could be exploited with precise, minimal intervention. She did not want to overthrow the Vermont dynasty. Overthrow was messy, public, and created martyrs. She wanted to hollow it out from inside, the way termites consume a house, while the exterior remains standing until one day the structure simply collapses under its own weight and everyone acts surprised even though the signs had been visible for years. The Duke's study door was open when she reached the third floor. Kedrick stood at the window with his back to her, motionless, watching the northern darkness beyond the glass. "The southern delegation left satisfied," she said, settling into the chair nearest the fire. "Lord Ashford signed the trade amendment. Minister Pren agreed to postpone the taxation vote until spring. Both outcomes favor your position." "My wife is riding through a blizzard carrying my child." "Your wife is a convicted poisoner fleeing justice with a disgraced officer." "She is still carrying my child." Evelise poured wine. The sound of liquid hitting crystal filled the silence between them with something that almost resembled normalcy. Almost. "Children survive difficult births, Kedrick. Dynasties do not survive hesitation. You sent cavalry. They will find her. And when they bring her back, the Empire will see that the Iron Duke's authority extends beyond these walls. That is what matters tonight." Kedrick turned from the window. His face had changed since the last time she saw him 3 hours ago. The controlled composure that defined his public presence had shifted into something rawer, something that sat closer to the surface of his skin and pulsed with a heat that made the air between them feel combustible. "Who told you about the tunnel passage beneath the eastern wing?" Evelise's hand paused on the wine glass. One heartbeat. Then it continued moving as if nothing had interrupted the motion. "I was not aware there was a tunnel passage beneath the eastern wing." The alarm was triggered by a breach in the underground archives section. Someone accessed the treasury records. The lock showed no forced entry, which means whoever opened it knew the mechanism. Serafina knew that mechanism because she managed the domestic accounts during her first year at Blackmere. "Then it seems your wife was more industrious than anyone suspected. Or someone wanted her to be industrious, someone who needed documents removed from those archives before I ordered an audit." Evelise met his eyes with perfect stillness. No flinching, no deflection, just the calm, unreadable surface of a woman who had practiced this exact expression in private mirrors for years until it became indistinguishable from genuine innocence. "You are exhausted," she said softly. 3 days of betrayal, a poisoning investigation, and now this. Your mind is doing what it always does under pressure, searching for patterns, testing every face in the room. It is what makes you formidable, Kedrick. But tonight it is making you see enemies where there are none. She stood and crossed the room toward him. Her hand touched his chest, just below the collarbone, where his heartbeat pushed against the fabric of his shirt with the slow, heavy rhythm of a machine that never stopped working, but had forgotten what it was building. "I am not your enemy," she whispered. "I am the only person in this castle who chose to stay when everyone else either fled or plotted." Kedrick looked down at her hand, then at her face. The fire threw warm light across her features and softened the sharpness that lived in her cheekbones and jawline during daylight hours. He wanted to believe her. That was the most dangerous part. Not the evidence, not the political calculations, not the cavalry riding through frozen darkness, searching for his pregnant wife. The most dangerous thing happening inside Blackmere Keep at that exact moment was that Kedrick Veramont wanted, with every damaged fiber of a personality built for suspicion, to believe that one person in his life was exactly who they claimed to be. He stepped back from her hand. "Pull the financial records from the last 18 months. Every trade agreement, every military contract, every revenue report from the Northern Territories. I want them on my desk by morning." Evelise's expression did not change. "Of course." "And Evelise Stasi." "Yes?" "If anything in those records does not match what you have told me about your family's involvement in Northern commerce, I will not have a conversation about it. I will act." The threat hung between them like a blade suspended by a single thread. Evelise held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she smiled the way someone smiles when they are holding a losing hand and need the table to believe otherwise. "You will find nothing," she said, "because there is nothing to find." She left the study. The door closed behind her with a quiet click that sounded like a lock engaging. Alone in the corridor, Evelise's face changed. The warmth drained from her features the way color drains from a body losing blood. Her jaw tightened, Her eyes hardened into something that resembled polished stone, reflective, impenetrable, dead. She walked quickly toward the servants' quarters on the ground floor. The corridors were empty at this hour, most staff having been dismissed after the reception. She found the room she needed, a small chamber behind the kitchen stores, and knocked twice with a specific rhythm. The door opened. A thin man with the unremarkable appearance of a mid-level administrative clerk stood inside. His name was Aldrin. He had worked inside Blackmere for 4 years. Nobody remembered when he arrived or who authorized his placement because Evelise had buried his credentials inside routine staff rotations that no one bothered auditing. "The Duchess accessed the archives," Evelise said. No greeting, no preamble. "She has the treasury records and the correspondence, all of it." Aldrin's face remained blank. "How much does the Duke know?" "He suspects." "He does not know. But he ordered a financial audit for the morning. If those records are cross-referenced against the provincial revenue reports we filed through the Arden channels, the discrepancies will surface within hours." "Can the records be replaced?" "Not in time. She took the originals." Aldrin was quiet for a moment, the kind of silence that meant calculations were being performed inside a mind trained to process variables the way a military strategist processes battlefield terrain. "Then we accelerate the timeline, Massetz," he said. "The Southern Lords are not ready. Lord Ashford's forces are still consolidating along the border." "They do not need to be ready. They need to be committed. There is a difference. A fully prepared army that never moves is worthless. A half-prepared army that strikes at the right moment can topple kingdoms." Evelise leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed. The emerald silk of Serafina's stolen gown caught the dim lamplight and threw green shadows across the stone wall behind her. "If we move now and fail, there is no second attempt. The Duke will burn every connection, every alliance, every asset my family has built over 3 generations. And if we wait for the audit to expose us, we hang." The word landed between them with the weight of absolute finality. Evelise stared at Aldrin for a long moment. Her breathing was even, controlled, but her pupils had dilated slightly, the way pupils dilate when the body's survival mechanisms detect a threat that the conscious mind has not yet fully processed. "Send the signal to the border garrisons," she said. "Ashford moves at dawn. Tell him the Duke is distracted, his cavalry is deployed north chasing ghosts, and the eastern defenses are operating at half strength because of the diplomatic reception staffing adjustments." "And the Duke?" Evelise straightened. The softness she had worn upstairs in Kaedric's study was gone, every trace of it. What remained was the architecture underneath, clean, cold, engineered for exactly this kind of moment. "The Duke will be dealt with when the walls fall, not before." She turned and walked back toward the main corridor. Her footsteps made no sound on the stone floor. 4 days later, Serafina collapsed. They had made it through 60 miles of unmapped forest, navigating by compass, and dead reckoning through terrain that fought them at every step. Fallen trees, frozen streams, snowdrifts deep enough to swallow horses to their chests. The temperature dropped so low on the 3rd night that ice formed on the inside of Cassian's armor, and his breath turned to frost before it left his lips. Serafina kept riding, through cramps that bent her double over the saddle, through waves of nausea that left her retching into the snow during brief stops, through the steady mounting pressure in her lower abdomen that told her the baby was shifting, descending, preparing for an arrival that was still weeks too early. On the 4th morning, she fell from her horse. Cassian caught her before she hit the frozen ground. Her body was burning. Fever had turned her skin into a furnace that radiated heat through layers of wool and leather. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused, moving across his face without recognition. "Serafina." He shook her gently. "Serafina, stay with me." Her lips moved. No sound came out. Then slowly, like words being dragged up from deep water, she whispered something that made Cassian's blood stop moving through his veins. "The baby is coming." They were 40 miles from Ashenmere, deep inside an unmapped forest. No physicians, no shelter beyond the trees, no warmth except what 2 exhausted horses and a soldier with shaking hands could provide. Cassian built a fire. He stripped his cloak and his outer armor and used them to create a barrier against the wind. He packed snow around the base to block drafts. He boiled water from a frozen stream using his helmet as a pot. And he held Seraphina's hand while she screamed into the empty forest and brought the heir to the Veramont dynasty into a world of ice, blood, and the sound of distant wolves howling across the frozen mountains. The child was small, too small, but his lungs filled with cold air, and he screamed with a fury that echoed through the trees like something ancient and unbreakable being born into a world that did not deserve him. Cassian wrapped the infant in his last dry shirt and placed him against Seraphina's chest. She was shaking so hard the baby trembled with her, both of them vibrating with exhaustion and shock, and the raw, primal aftermath of survival at its most fundamental. "He is alive," Cassian said. Seraphina looked down at her son. Tears cut through the grime and fever sweat on her face, drawing clean lines down her cheeks like rivers carving through damaged earth. "He has his father's eyes," she whispered. Cassian said nothing, because there was nothing to say to a woman who had just given birth alone in a frozen wilderness, while the man who put her there hunted her across an empire. He stood guard through the night with his sword drawn and his back against the wind. By morning, smoke rose from the direction of Blackmere. Not chimney smoke, war smoke. The kind of thick, black, oil-fed smoke that came from burning fortifications and siege engines and the systematic destruction of infrastructure that took generations to build. Cassian climbed the nearest ridge and looked south. What he saw made his face drain of every remaining trace of color. The horizon was on fire. Not a single point, not a skirmish. A line of flames stretching east to west across the entire southern edge of the Northern Territories, like a wound being torn open across the body of the empire itself. He scrambled back down to the camp where Seraphina lay wrapped in furs with the baby pressed against her chest. "The Southern Lords have moved," he said. His voice carried the hollow quality of a man delivering information he did not want to possess. "Full-scale military mobilization. Blackmere is under attack." Seraphina's fevered eyes sharpened. The fog of exhaustion burned away in an instant, replaced by the hard, calculating clarity that had kept her alive through 3 years of political survival inside a fortress run by a man who trusted nothing and no one. "Evelise," she said. She accelerated the timeline. The documents I took forced her hand. "If Blackmere falls, the entire Northern Territory collapses. Every province, every garrison, every trade route and supply line. The empire fractures." Seraphina looked down at the infant sleeping against her chest. His small fingers curled around the fabric of her dress. His breathing was steady and shallow and utterly oblivious to the fact that the world he had been born into was tearing itself apart. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, whatever had been left of the frightened woman who fled Blackmere barefoot in a snowstorm was gone. What replaced it was something quieter, harder, forged in 4 days of frozen wilderness, a premature birth, and the understanding that the documents pressed against her ribs were no longer evidence to save a marriage. They were the only weapon that could save an empire. "Help me onto the horse," she said. "You cannot ride, not after what your body just endured." "Help me onto the horse, Cassian." He stared at her. The fire crackled between them. Smoke rose from the southern horizon like the breath of something massive and terrible waking beneath the earth. Then he lifted her carefully onto the saddle, placed the baby inside a makeshift sling against her chest, and mounted his own horse. They rode south, toward the fire, toward Blackmere, toward the man who had locked her in the cold and the woman who had set the empire ablaze. And behind them, the forest swallowed every trace of the place where the Veramont heir had been born, as if the world itself understood that what was coming next would leave no room for the memory of anything as fragile as a beginning. The southern horizon burned for 3 days straight. Kydrick watched it from the ramparts of Blackmere Keep while his war council shouted behind him in the strategy chamber, their voices colliding over maps and troop numbers and supply projections that no longer meant anything because the numbers had already lost. 3 border garrisons overrun, 2 trade routes severed, the village of Caldermore reduced to ash in a single night by cavalry wearing the colors of Lord Ashford's Southern Alliance, and every attack followed the same surgical pattern. Strike Veramont supply lines first, collapse communication networks second, isolate the fortress from its supporting provinces like cutting arteries to starve a heart. Someone inside Blackmere had given them the blueprint. Someone who knew every garrison rotation, every supply depot location, every structural weakness in the Duke's military infrastructure with the kind of intimate precision that could only come from sustained access to the war chamber itself. Kadrick knew this. He felt it the way a man with a blade in his back feels the steel before he sees the blood. But knowing something lived inside his walls and identifying what it looked like were two different operations, and the second one required a kind of stillness that the Iron Duke could not afford while his empire burned around him. Marshal Corvin entered the rampart carrying a field report sealed with black wax. The color meant casualties. The thickness of the document meant the number was ugly. Garrison Ironmere fell at dawn, Corvin said. 1,200 men. Commander Hessick attempted a breakout through the western flank, but Ashford's archers had already fortified the tree line. No survivors reported. Kedrick took the report without opening it. He held it in his hand like a man weighing something on a scale that only he could see. Where's my cavalry? Still deployed north, searching for the Duchess. Recall them. Corvin hesitated. The hesitation lasted less than a second, but in Kadrick Veremont's world, a second of hesitation from a military commander carried the same weight as a written confession. All 12 units? Every single horse, every single rider. I want them redeployed along the southern corridor within 48 hours. That means abandoning the search for your wife. My wife has been running for 4 days through unmapped winter terrain while 7 months pregnant. If she is still alive, she will surface on her own terms. If she is not alive, no amount of cavalry will change that. The words came out flat, mechanical, stripped of every frequency that might have indicated the speaker possessed a functioning emotional interior. The Empire takes priority. Your Grace, with respect, the child she carries is I know what she carries. I also know that an heir is worthless without a kingdom to inherit. Recall the cavalry. That is not a request. Corvin saluted and left. Kadrick opened the field report. The numbers were worse than ugly. They were catastrophic. Ashford's coalition had mobilized faster and with more coordinated precision than any military alliance in Northern history. The kind of coordination that did not emerge from battlefield improvisation. It was engineered, planned, fed by intelligence that came from the very center of Veremont Command. He set the report on the stone ledge and pressed both palms flat against the rampart wall. The cold bit through his skin, but he did not feel it. He was thinking, not strategically, something deeper, something that operated in the sub-basement of cognition, where the mind processes threats that the conscious surface refuses to acknowledge, because acknowledging them would require dismantling the entire structure built on top of them. 3 years of Evelise's presence inside Blackmere. 3 years of her careful, patient infiltration of every administrative system, every personnel roster, every communication channel that connected the Duke's authority to the empire it governed. He had watched her do it, not blindly. He had watched her accumulate influence the way he watched subordinates accumulate anything, with measured attention and the calculation that her ambition served his interests as long as it remained contained within useful boundaries. The mistake was not trusting Evelise. The mistake was believing he could control her the way he controlled everything else, because Kadrick Veremont had spent his entire adult life operating under a single foundational assumption. That power, properly applied, could contain any threat, manage any variable, neutralize any risk. That the world was a machine and he was the engineer, and as long as he maintained sufficient pressure on every moving part, the system would function according to his design. But people were not machines. And the woman he had invited into his fortress, into his bed, into the operational center of his empire, had been running a parallel system inside his own walls for 3 years, while he stood at the controls of a machine that no longer responded to his commands. He left the rampart and walked to Evelise's chambers. The door was unlocked. Inside, the room smelled of jasmine oil and candle wax. Her belongings were arranged with the meticulous precision of someone who controlled their environment down to the angle of books on a shelf. Everything in its place. Everything communicating order, calm, trustworthiness. Kadrick opened her writing desk. Empty. He checked the drawers, the wardrobe, the hidden panel behind the fireplace mantel that existed in every noble chamber at Blackmere. a security feature installed by his grandfather during a period of court assassinations. All empty. Not empty the way a room is empty when someone leaves temporarily. Empty the way a room is empty when someone has systematically removed every piece of evidence that could connect them to anything. Kedrick stood in the center of the stripped room and felt something shift inside his chest, not the mechanical tightening he had been misidentifying as anger for the past 4 days. Something structural, something foundational, the sound a building makes when the ground beneath it begins to move, and every beam, every joint, every load-bearing wall suddenly discovers that the physics it depended on no longer apply. He found Evelise in the great hall. She stood near the fireplace wearing a dark blue gown, speaking with 2 members of the household staff in low, measured tones. When she saw Kedrick approaching, she dismissed the servants with a gesture so subtle it looked like a natural conclusion to the conversation rather than an order. "Your chambers have been cleared," Kedrick said. Evelise did not blink. "I moved several personal items to a more secure location during the attacks. With military activity escalating, it seemed prudent." "What items?" "Correspondence, financial documents, family records that hold sentimental value." "Where?" "The Eastern Storage Vault. I can have them retrieved if you require inspection." Kedrick studied her face the way a man studies a lock he is trying to pick, searching for the mechanism, the weakness, the single tumbler that, once turned, would open everything behind the facade. "The Southern Coalition is operating on intelligence that could only come from inside this fortress," he said. "They knew the garrison rotations at Ironmere. They knew the supply depot locations along the border. They knew the exact timing of our diplomatic reception, which means they knew our eastern defenses would be understaffed." Evelise's expression arranged itself into concern. Controlled, proportional, appropriate concern that matched the severity of the information without exceeding it. The performance was flawless. "You suspect a spy," she said. "I suspect something worse than a spy. I suspect someone with unrestricted access to the war chamber, someone who has been inside my strategic planning for months, possibly years, feeding every tactical decision I make directly to the people currently burning my empire. That narrows the field considerably. Only senior military staff and your closest advisors have war chamber access. And you." The 2 words dropped between them like a stone into still water. The ripples spread outward through the silence, reaching every wall of the great hall, bouncing back, multiplying. Evelise held his gaze. 3 seconds. 5. 7. Kedrick. "Who is Aldrin?" The name hit her face the way a fist hits muscle. Not a visible break, but a contraction, a tightening beneath the surface that lasted less than a heartbeat before her features smoothed back into composure. "I do not recognize that name." "A clerk in the household staff. Arrived 4 years ago through a routine personnel rotation that no one authorized because the authorization documents were buried inside a filing system redesigned by your personal administrative assistant 6 months after your arrival. I oversee dozens of staff rotations. I cannot be expected to—" His communication seal matches one found on correspondence recovered from a dead courier intercepted at the border 3 weeks ago. The correspondence contained detailed schematics of Blackmere's defensive fortifications, including the underground tunnel network that my wife used to access the Treasury archives the night she fled. Evelise was quiet. Not the strategic silence of someone calculating their next response. Something different. The silence of a mechanism being recalibrated in real time as every planned response, every rehearsed explanation, every carefully constructed alibi failed to match the variables now presenting themselves. "You are making connections that do not exist," she said. Her voice remained steady, but the steadiness had shifted from natural to maintained, a distinction so fine that only someone who had spent decades reading human behavior under extreme pressure would have detected it. "The stress of this siege is compromising your judgment. You accused your wife of poisoning you based on planted evidence, and now you are searching for the next target because admitting you were wrong about Serafina would require admitting you were wrong about yourself." The sentence landed like a blade between Kedrick's ribs, not because it was a lie, because it was true. And because Evelise wielded truth the same way she wielded everything else, as a tool, as a weapon. as a precisely calibrated instrument designed to penetrate the exact emotional vulnerability that would cause maximum damage at the moment of greatest impact. "You have been studying me," Kadrick said. "I have been living beside you." "Those are the same thing for someone like you." Evelisa's mask cracked, not dramatically, not the shattering collapse of a facade under pressure, just a thin fracture line running through the surface, the way a crack appears in ice before the entire sheet gives way. Her eyes shifted. Something behind them surfaced for a fraction of a second. Cold. Calculating. Ancient in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the kind of patience required to maintain a lie across years of intimate proximity. Then it was gone. "I think you should rest," she said. "I think you should answer the question." "Well, what question?" Kadrick stepped closer. Close enough that the firelight illuminated every line in his face and every shadow beneath his eyes, and every visible consequence of 4 days without sleep in a fortress under siege by enemies he had personally empowered through his own catastrophic inability to distinguish between loyalty and performance. "Who are you?" Evelise stared at him. The great hall stretched behind her in cold, echoing silence. Firelight danced across the stone walls where portraits of dead Veramont dukes watched the scene with the permanent indifference of men who had already lost everything and no longer cared who inherited the wreckage. "I am the woman who stood beside you when your wife betrayed you," she said. "My wife did not betray me." The words left his mouth before his conscious mind authorized them. They came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that had been processing information beneath the surface of his awareness for days, assembling fragments and contradictions and discrepancies into a picture he had refused to look at because looking at it meant seeing himself inside it. Serafina had not fled like a guilty woman fleeing punishment. She had fled like a desperate woman carrying evidence that no one inside the fortress would allow her to present. She had fled towards something, not away from consequence, but toward the only mechanism left that could stop what was happening inside his own walls. She had tried to save him, and he had sent cavalry to hunt her down. The realization did not arrive gradually, it detonated. A single explosive moment of clarity that blew through every defense, every rationalization, every carefully constructed justification he had built around the decision to condemn his pregnant wife without hearing her speak. The blast radius was total. It reached backward through time and illuminated every choice that had led him here. Every moment he had chosen control over connection. Every instinct he had followed that told him vulnerability was death, and trust was suicide, and love was the most dangerous liability a powerful man could carry. His father's face flashed through his mind, the same cold eyes, the same certainty, the same absolute conviction that the world was a battlefield and everyone in it was either a weapon or a target. Kadrick had spent 34 years becoming his father, and his father had died alone in a fortress full of people who feared him and mourned nothing. "Marshal Corvin," Kadrick said without looking away from Evelise. The doors at the far end of the great hall opened. Corvin stepped inside with 4 armed guards flanking him. He had been waiting. Because soldiers who survived 2 decades under Veramont command developed an instinct for moments when the air changed direction. Detain Lady Arden in the Eastern Tower. No visitors, no communication, no access to any member of the household staff. Evelise did not move. Her face completed its transformation. The warmth, the concern, the carefully performed intimacy dissolved like wax under flame, revealing the architecture underneath. Sharp, clean, built for exactly this kind of exposure. "You're making a mistake that will cost you everything you have left," she said. Her voice no longer carried the soft, measured tone she had used for 3 years inside his bed. It carried something real, something that had been hiding behind the performance like a blade concealed inside a velvet sleeve. "I have made mistakes that already cost me everything. This is not one of them. Your empire is burning. Your wife is gone. Your heir was born in a frozen wilderness because of choices you made, not choices I made. I did not create the man who locks pregnant women in courtyards and sends cavalry after the people who try to help them. That man existed long before I walked through your gates. You are right." Kadrick's voice was quiet, stripped of volume, stripped of authority, stripped of every layer of performance that had made the Iron Duke a figure of terror across the northern territories. "That man did exist, and you saw him clearly enough to use every broken piece of him for your own purpose. That is not an accusation. That is an observation. The guards moved forward. Evelise did not resist. She walked between them toward the eastern tower with her back straight and her head raised and the absolute composure of someone who had anticipated this outcome and had already planned for what came next. At the threshold of the great hall, she stopped, turned her head just enough to meet Cadric's eyes one final time. You should ask yourself something, Duke. If I saw every weakness in you clearly enough to exploit them, why did she stay long enough to love you despite them? She walked through the door. The guards followed. The iron bolt slid into place. Cadric stood alone in the great hall of his ancestors. The fire crackled. The portraits stared. The distant sound of war drums rolled across the southern horizon like a pulse beating inside the chest of a dying empire. He looked at his hands, the scar tissue across his knuckles from years of combat and negotiation, and the physical enforcement of absolute authority. These hands had signed execution orders, had gripped sword hilts during battles that created widows across 3 provinces, had pressed flat against maps and tables while he decided the fates of thousands, with the casual efficiency of a man sorting paperwork. These same hands had touched Serafina's face on the night she told him she was pregnant, had rested against the swell of her stomach with a tenderness he did not recognize as his own, had pushed her away from the fire and into the cold because a vial of poison planted by the woman he chose over her was more convincing than 3 years of loyalty, sacrifice, and the quiet, persistent act of loving a man who had made himself nearly impossible to love. The drums grew louder, the fire dimmed, and somewhere in the northern wilderness, riding south through frozen forests with a newborn child strapped against her chest and stolen documents pressed beneath her cloak, the woman he had destroyed was coming back. Not for him, for the empire he was no longer sure he deserved. Cadric crossed the great hall to the war chamber. He spread the tactical maps across the table. Troop positions, supply lines, defensive formations. The language of a lifetime spent believing that military precision could solve any problem, neutralize any threat, overcome any obstacle. But the map showed him something that no military strategy could address. Blackmere was surrounded. Ashford's southern coalition had completed its encirclement, while Cadric's cavalry chased ghosts through the northern forests. The eastern defenses, weakened by the reception staffing adjustments that Evelise had subtly recommended, had collapsed under coordinated assault. The western supply route, the last remaining corridor connecting Blackmere to loyal territories, was under siege by forces that had been positioned there weeks before the first attack, meaning the timeline for this operation began long before Serafina's flight triggered the acceleration. He had been outmaneuvered, not on a battlefield, not in a negotiation chamber, not in any arena where his skills and experience gave him advantage. He had been outmaneuvered inside his own mind. Every decision he made for the past 3 years had been shaped, nudged, calibrated by a woman who understood that the most effective way to destroy a man obsessed with control was not to fight his control, but to feed it. Give him what he craved. Reinforce every paranoid instinct. Validate every suspicious impulse. Make him believe his worst qualities were his greatest strengths, until those qualities consumed the only genuine connections that might have saved him from himself. Cadric gripped the edge of the table so hard the wood creaked beneath his fingers. His breathing was ragged now. The mechanical steadiness that had defined his physical presence for decades was gone. What remained was raw, exposed, shaking with the kind of internal seismic activity that precedes either complete collapse or complete transformation. There was no middle ground. The man he had been could not survive what was coming. The Iron Duke, the military strategist, the ruthless authority who governed through fear and precision and the systematic elimination of every human vulnerability. That man had been built on a foundation of assumptions that were now rubble. Control is safety. Vulnerability is death. Trust is suicide. Every one of those assumptions had led him here, to a besieged fortress, a shattered empire, a wife and son alone in a frozen wilderness, and a great hall full of silence where the echoes of his own authority mocked him from every wall. He could rebuild the Iron Duke, harden the walls, double the defenses, fight the siege with the same cold, mechanical precision that had won him every battle and lost him every person who ever mattered. Or he could do what the Iron Duke had never once done in 34 years of existence. Break. Not the performative breaking of a man who sheds one tear before resuming his mask. The kind of breaking that reaches structural foundations, that cracks the load-bearing walls, that forces a complete redesign because the original architecture was not built wrong in a few places, but fundamentally, catastrophically flawed from the foundation up. Cedric Veramont closed his eyes in the war chamber of his ancestors and let the Iron Duke die. Not with ceremony, not with drama, with silence. And when he opened his eyes, the man who looked at the siege maps was not the man who had stood on the ramparts 4 days ago, watching his empire burn while convincing himself that certainty mattered more than truth. He was someone who did not yet have a name, but who understood for the first time that survival required something more terrifying than any battlefield he had ever faced. It required becoming someone he did not yet know how to be. The war drums rolled across the southern mountains. The fire in the Great Hall died to embers. And 40 miles north, Serafina Veramont rode toward Blackmere with the evidence that could save the empire and a child who had been born into the exact moment when his father finally learned that power without love was not strength. It was the most elaborate form of self-destruction ever mistaken for authority. Cedric Veramont walked through the corridors of Blackmere Keep at dawn carrying no sword, no armor, no insignia of rank. The servants he passed pressed themselves against stone walls out of reflex, the trained instinct of people who had spent years navigating the gravitational field of a man whose moods determined whether they ate or bled. But something was different this morning. The Duke moved through his own fortress like a stranger learning the layout for the first time. His eyes touched door frames, tapestries, cracked stone, the worn grooves in the floor where generations of boots had carved shallow rivers into marble. He saw every detail as if the walls themselves were confessing things he had been too armored to hear. He reached the eastern tower. The guards at the iron door straightened to attention. Cedric waved them aside without speaking and stepped into the chamber where Evelise Arden sat with her wrists bound in front of her, positioned on the same wooden chair that Serafina had used during her months of confinement in this exact room. The symmetry was not accidental. Cedric had ordered it. Evelise looked up. Her face had lost the performative warmth entirely now. What remained was clean bone structure and cold intelligence, the framework of a woman who had never needed beauty as anything more than camouflage for the predatory machinery operating beneath it. "Have you come to execute me?" she asked. "I came to ask you one question." "Ask?" "The night the poison was planted in Serafina's chamber, you arranged the vial, the burned correspondence, the servant testimony. All of it was manufactured. I know that now. What I need to understand is whether you believed I would accept the evidence without investigation, or whether you knew I would." Evelise studied him with the detached interest of a scientist observing experimental results. There is no difference between those two things. There is an enormous difference. Not for a man like you, not for the man you were. She leaned forward slightly, the chains between her wrists catching the gray morning light from the narrow window. "I did not need to trick you, Cedric. I needed to give you permission. You already suspected everyone around you. You already believed loyalty was a performance people staged to avoid punishment. All I did was hand you a reason to act on beliefs you already carried. The poison was not the weapon. Your own mind was the weapon. I simply aimed it." The words landed in the center of Cedric's chest and sat there like shrapnel, not because they were cruel, because they were precise, surgically, devastatingly precise. "You studied me," he said, "for 3 years. Every fear, every reflex, every instinct that fires when you feel control slipping. You are remarkably consistent, Cedric. That is what made you so predictable. And my wife? Your wife was the only variable I could not control. She refused to hate you. She refused to abandon the people under your domain, even while you abandoned her. She built loyalty not through fear, but through competence and care. And that kind of loyalty cannot be purchased or manufactured or destroyed through scandal because it lives inside the people who received it. I needed her removed because she was the one structural element in your empire that I could not replicate or replace." Cedric was quiet for a long time. The wind pushed against the tower walls outside, carrying the distant sound of war drums from the southern siege line like a heartbeat belonging to something massive and dying. "Where's Aldrin?" he asked. Evelise's eyes shifted. "Not much. A fraction of movement that traveled from his face to the floor and back in less than a second. But it was enough. Aldrin left the fortress during the initial attack. He carried activation orders for the secondary assault force positioned along the western supply corridor. What secondary force? 2,000 infantry and siege engineers hidden inside abandoned mining tunnels 3 miles west of Blackmere. They have been there for 6 weeks. Supplied through a network of civilian trade wagons, I routed through your own logistical channels. Your quartermaster signed the cargo manifests himself. He believed he was provisioning remote watchtowers. Kadrick's jaw tightened. The muscles worked beneath his skin with the grinding motion of someone processing information that restructured every tactical assumption currently keeping his fortress standing. When do they move? Tonight, midnight. They breach the western wall while Ashford maintains pressure on the southern front. Your defenders split, your reserves collapse. Blackmere falls before sunrise. Why are you telling me this? Evelise tilted her head. Something moved through her expression that almost resembled genuine curiosity. Because it does not matter. You cannot defend 2 fronts with the forces you have. You cannot recall cavalry that is still 12 hours from arrival. You cannot manufacture soldiers or fortify a wall section that my engineers have already identified down to the individual stone blocks that will be targeted. You have approximately 16 hours before this fortress becomes rubble. And there is nothing the Iron Duke or whatever you have become since last night can do to change that. She sat back in her chair. The chain settled against her lap with a quiet metallic sound. I'm telling you because I want you to feel what it is like, knowing the exact dimensions of your own destruction and being completely powerless to stop it. Kadrick looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and left the tower without another word. He walked to the war chamber, spread the maps, located the western mining tunnels Evelise had described, cross-referenced the position with the supply route records that bore his own quartermaster's signature. Every detail confirmed, every element verified. The trap had been built over months using his own infrastructure, his own people, his own systems turned against him with the elegant, devastating efficiency of a machine designed to consume itself. 16 hours. 2,000 additional enemy troops approaching from a direction his current defensive formation could not cover without abandoning the southern barricades entirely. Marshal Corvin entered the war chamber without being summoned. The man had a soldier's instinct for catastrophe. He could read it in the way officers walked, the way doors opened, the way silence accumulated inside corridors that should have carried the sound of organized military activity. How bad? Corvin asked. Western tunnels, 2,000 infantry, midnight breach. Corvin's face did not change, but his right hand closed into a fist at his side. The involuntary contraction of a man whose body understood the information before his conscious mind finished processing it. We cannot hold both fronts. No. Then we choose which front to lose. No. Kadrick placed both hands on the map and leaned forward until the territory spread beneath him like the body of a patient on an operating table. We do not choose which front to lose. We choose which front to win first. First implies a sequence. A sequence implies time we do not have. We have 16 hours. That is enough time to do one thing we have never done before, which is stop defending. Corvin stared at him. The firelight caught the silver in his hair and made him look older than his years, the way war-aged men from the inside out, until their exterior finally caught up with the damage beneath. You want to attack. I want to hit Ashford's southern line with everything we have. Full garrison. Every soldier, every siege weapon, every reserve unit currently holding defensive positions along the perimeter. Leave the walls empty. Leave the gates open. Everything we have goes south in a single concentrated assault designed to break Ashford's center before the western force arrives. If we strip the walls, the western assault takes the fortress without resistance. They take an empty fortress. Stone and wood and furniture. Nothing strategic, nothing valuable. Nothing worth holding without supply lines, because the moment we break Ashford's southern force, we cut the coalition's logistical spine. The Western Assault Force has 6 weeks of tunnel provisions, which means they are already operating at the edge of supply endurance. An empty fortress with no supply corridor becomes a trap, not a prize. Corvin was quiet for several seconds. His military mind processed the proposal through decades of tactical experience, testing every variable, probing every vulnerability, measuring the distance between calculated risk and suicidal recklessness. You are gambling the entire Vermont legacy on a single assault. The Vermont legacy is already lost. Everything I built, everything my father built, everything this house accumulated over generations. It was hollowed out years ago by a woman who used my own paranoia as her primary weapon. There is no legacy to protect. There is only a choice between dying behind walls that have already been compromised or fighting in the open with nothing left to lose. He straightened from the map. His eyes held something Corvin had never seen in 30 years of military service under 2 Vermont dukes. Not the cold certainty of a commander issuing orders, not the calculated composure of a strategist managing variables. Something rawer, something that looked like a man who had been stripped of every layer of armor, every justification, every defense mechanism that separated him from the unfiltered consequences of his own choices, and who had discovered that the thing remaining underneath was not weakness. It was clarity, the kind of clarity that only arrived when every alternative had been destroyed. "Mobilize at dusk," Kedrick said. "Full assault formation. I ride at the front. Your Grace, if you fall in the initial engagement, then the Duke of Vermont dies on a battlefield instead of hiding behind walls built by better men. That is not the worst outcome available to us today." Corvin held his eyes for a moment that stretched across the entire history of their professional relationship. Then he nodded once, not the sharp mechanical nod of a subordinate obeying a command. Something slower, something that carried weight. The nod of a soldier who recognized that the man standing before him had become, for the first time, someone worth following into an engagement that might kill them all. "Dusk," Corvin repeated. Then he left. Kedrick spent the remaining hours doing something the Iron Duke had never done. He walked through Blackmere Keep and spoke to the people inside it. Not commanders, not nobles, not ministers or advisors, or anyone whose loyalty was transactional. He walked to the kitchens where the cooks were rationing flour for siege bread. He walked to the stables where the grooms were preparing horses they suspected would not return. He walked to the infirmary where wounded soldiers from the initial attacks lay on cots with bandages soaked through and faces that carried the particular emptiness of men who had accepted that their odds were mathematical rather than hopeful. He did not give speeches. He did not perform the kind of inspirational theater that military commanders deployed before desperate engagements. He spoke to each person he encountered with the stripped-down directness of someone who had recently discovered that language had uses beyond command and manipulation. In the kitchen, a woman with flour-dusted arms and exhausted eyes asked him if the fortress would hold. "Probably not," Kedrick said, "but holding it was never the point." "Then what is?" He looked at her. "A cook. A woman who had worked inside his fortress for years, and whose name he had never learned because the Iron Duke did not learn the names of people who could not advance or threaten his position, making sure the people who did this answer for it, and making sure the ones who survive have something worth surviving for." The woman held his gaze with the unflinching directness of someone who had stopped being afraid of authority because fear required energy she no longer had to spare. "My name is Marin," she said, "in case you were wondering." Kedrick almost smiled. It did not quite reach his face, but it moved somewhere behind his eyes like light shifting beneath deep water. "I was not wondering, but I should have been." Dusk arrived the way winter dusks arrive in the north. Fast. Absolute. The sky went from gray to black in less than 40 minutes, and the temperature dropped with it until the air itself felt like a weapon being pressed against every exposed surface of skin. Blackmere's gates opened. The entire garrison poured south in a column of steel, leather, and horse muscle that thundered across the frozen landscape toward Ashford's siege line like a fist being thrown by a man who no longer cared whether the impact broke his hand. Kedrick rode at the front wearing battle armor he had not touched in 3 years. The metal was cold against his chest. The sword at his hip weighed less than the decisions that had brought him here. The southern line saw them coming. Alarm fires ignited along Ashford's perimeter. Horns sounded across the frozen fields. Infantry formations scrambled into defensive positions while cavalry units wheeled into intercept trajectories. But they were not prepared for this. Every military engagement the coalition had planned was built around the assumption that Blackmere would defend, that the Duke would hunker behind his walls and bleed slowly while the siege tightened, that the Iron Duke's psychology, his need for control, his obsession with holding territory, would keep him pinned inside his fortress until the Western assault delivered the killing blow. Nobody planned for a full garrison assault. Nobody planned for an empty fortress. Nobody planned for a man who had already lost everything and was now operating on the one fuel source that fear and strategy could not neutralize. The absolute bone-deep clarity of someone who understood that the only thing more dangerous than a man fighting for power was a man fighting because power had failed him completely and he had discovered something worth dying for that existed outside his own ambition. The collision was devastating. Kedrick's vanguard hit Ashford's center like a battering ram. Steel met steel across a front line that stretched 300 yards through frozen farmland. Horses screamed, men fell. Blood turned the snow to dark slush that churned beneath thousands of boots and hooves until the ground itself became a weapon, sucking men down into freezing mud that grabbed at their legs and held them while blades found the gaps in their armor. Kedrick fought from horseback with a brutality that terrified even his own soldiers. He cut through Ashford's forward infantry with strokes that carried the full weight of a body that had been built for exactly this kind of violence. The scar along his jaw opened where a lance grazed him. Blood ran down his neck and soaked into the collar of his armor, mixing with sweat and melted snow until his entire upper body was slick with the physical evidence of a man operating past every boundary that survival instinct normally enforced. Around him, the battle split into 1,000 individual nightmares. Cavalry charges that crashed into pike formations, archers firing blind into smoke-filled darkness, siege engines launching flaming projectiles that drew burning arcs across the night sky, like signatures being written on the underside of the clouds. Marshal Corvin held the right flank with the discipline of a man who had seen enough battles to know that surviving the first 30 minutes determined everything. His voice cut through the chaos with commands that arrived at exactly the moment each unit needed them, a metronome of tactical precision that kept the assault formation from dissolving into the disorganized slaughter that consumed most desperate engagements. The center held. Then it pushed forward. Ashford's infantry began to buckle under the sustained pressure of an assault they had not anticipated and could not absorb because their defensive posture was designed for siege maintenance, not direct combat against a garrison fighting with the ferocity of men who had decided that retreat was no longer a concept worth acknowledging. 2 hours into the engagement, Ashford's center broke. The collapse started at the command position. Lord Ashford himself ordered a tactical withdrawal when his forward reserves were overrun by Vermont cavalry that had circled through a frozen streambed and hit his flank at a perpendicular angle. The withdrawal was meant to be orderly. It was not. Withdrawal under pressure against an enemy that refused to disengage was not a strategy. It was a wish. And wishes died fast on battlefields. Kedrick pursued, through the broken line, through the scattered infantry, through the command tents where maps and dispatches lay scattered across tables still warm from the bodies that had occupied them minutes before. He rode until his horse could not run anymore, then dismounted and moved on foot through terrain that smelled like iron and smoke, and the particular chemical sweetness of human bodies open to winter air. He found Lord Ashford in a collapsed supply tent 300 yards behind the former front line. The Southern Lord was wounded, a deep gash across his thigh that had soaked his trousers dark. He sat against a broken supply crate with his sword across his lap and the exhausted expression of a man watching a plan he had invested everything in disintegrate in real time. "Your Western force arrives in 4 hours," Kedrick said. He was breathing hard. Blood covered his hands and forearms. The scar along his jaw had stopped bleeding and started to swell. "They will find an empty fortress, no supply corridor, and a Southern coalition that no longer exists as a fighting force. You lost." Ashford looked up at him. The firelight from a nearby burning tent threw shifting shadows across his face. "I did not start this war, Vermont. Your woman did. The Arden family has been engineering this conflict for 3 years. I was a tool, the same way you were a tool. The only difference is I knew I was being used. You genuinely believed you were in control." "Who else is in the coalition?" "Names? Every lord, every military commander, every political figure who committed resources to this operation. You want names from a man bleeding to death in a burning tent." I want names from a man who has exactly one chance to determine whether his family survives this night. Your sons, your estates, your bloodline, every piece of legacy your house has built over generations. I can preserve it, or I can destroy it. That decision takes approximately 10 seconds and depends entirely on the next words out of your mouth. Ashford stared at him. The calculation was visible, the weighing of options, the measuring of threats, the assessment of whether the man standing above him meant what he said or was performing the kind of battlefield theater that powerful men deployed to extract concessions they could not enforce. But something in Keedrick's face must have communicated what words could not, because Ashford started talking. 7 noble families, 3 military commanders, 2 provincial governors, a network that stretched across the empire like root systems beneath a forest, connected and sustained by the Arden family's financial infrastructure and Eveluse's strategic direction. Keedrick memorized every name, every connection, every detail. Then he bound Ashford's wound with a strip torn from his own cloak and called for a field physician. Ashford watched him with something that looked like confusion. The Iron Duke does not show mercy on battlefields. The Iron Duke died last night. I have not figured out what replaced him yet. He mounted a fresh horse from the captured supply line and turned north, toward Blackmere, toward the empty fortress that his enemy's western force was now approaching through mining tunnels, expecting to take a defended castle and instead finding open gates and silent corridors. Toward the moment he had been riding toward since the night he locked his pregnant wife in the snow and chose fear over trust. He was a mile from the northern road when Corvin caught him on horseback, riding hard through the aftermath of the shattered siege line. "Scouts report movement on the northern road," Corvin shouted over the wind. "The Western assault force?" "No, coming from the north. A single rider and a horse bearing double weight, moving south toward Blackmere at speed." Keidrick's entire body changed. Not his posture, not his expression, something deeper. Something tectonic that shifted beneath the surface of muscle and bone and the accumulated scar tissue of 34 years spent building a man who could withstand everything except the one thing currently riding toward him through the frozen darkness. "How far?" 3 miles, maybe less." Keidrick kicked the horse. The animal surged forward through snow that exploded around its legs in white bursts that caught the moonlight and turned the landscape into something that looked less like a battlefield and more like the surface of a world being remade. He saw her before she saw him, a single dark figure on horseback, moving through the tree line at the edge of the northern road. Even at distance, even through the darkness and the wind and the snow swirling between them, he recognized the way she sat a horse, straight-backed, defiant, carrying something against her chest with both arms wrapped around it in a grip that communicated the same message his own hands had communicated when they gripped sword hilts during combat. "This belongs to me. Come and take it if you dare." Serafina pulled her horse to a stop 50 yards from him. The animal was blown, trembling. Steam rose from its flanks in thick clouds that the wind tore apart before they reached shoulder height. Cassian's horse stood behind hers, riderless. Cassian himself was nowhere visible. Keidrick dismounted. His boots hit the frozen ground and he walked forward through the snow. No weapon drawn, no guards flanking him, just a man walking through a winter landscape toward a woman he had nearly destroyed. Serafina dismounted slowly. The bundle against her chest moved. A small sound escaped from beneath the wool wrapping. Not a cry, a breath. The quiet, persistent breathing of a newborn who had entered the world in a frozen forest and refused, against every statistical probability, to stop existing. They stood 10 feet apart. The wind screamed between them. The moonlight turned the snow to silver and their breath to vapor, and their faces to landscapes of damage and exhaustion and something else that lived beneath both. "Cassian took a crossbow bolt 6 miles north," Serafina said. Her voice was raw, shredded by cold and screaming and days of riding through conditions that should have killed her twice. "Ashford's scouts. The bolt caught him in the shoulder. He fell. Told me to keep riding. I kept riding." "Is he alive?" "He was alive when I left him. That was 2 hours ago." Keidrick looked at the bundle in her arms. The infant was wrapped in layers of torn fabric and what appeared to be the lining of a military cloak. One small fist had worked free from the wrapping and hung in the frozen air, fingers curled, defiant, even in sleep. He looked at Serafina's face. The fever was visible in her eyes. The skin around her cheekbones had gone translucent with dehydration and exhaustion. She was shaking so hard the baby trembled with her. "You came back," he said. "I did not come back for you. I know. I came back because these documents expose every financial connection, every military contract, every trade manipulation the Arden family used to dismantle your empire from inside your own walls. The Imperial Council needs to see them. If Blackmere falls before that happens, the evidence is buried and Evelisa's network survives. They rebuild. They find another duke. They do this again." She reached beneath her cloak and pulled out the bundle of treasury records and sealed correspondence. The documents were stained with travel, with sweat, with the particular discoloration that came from being pressed against a body for days without rest. She held them toward him. "Take them. Ride for the Imperial Council at Ashenmere. You have the military authority to demand an emergency tribunal. Use it." Kedrick looked at the documents, then at her face, then at the infant sleeping against her chest with one small fist raised against a world that had tried to kill him before he drew his first breath. "Come with me. I can barely stand. The horse is finished, and your son needs warmth and food within the next hour, or he will not survive the night." "Then I stay." "If you stay, the evidence does not reach the council. If the evidence does not reach the council, every death tonight, every burning village, every soldier who bled in that field means nothing." Kedrick took one step forward, then another. He stopped within arm's reach of her and looked down at his son. The infant's face was red and creased and impossibly small against the rough fabric surrounding him. His breathing came in tiny, rapid puffs that turned to vapor in the frozen air and disappeared. He reached out one hand, his fingers, still bloody from combat, still trembling from hours of violence and adrenaline, and the complete structural collapse of every identity he had ever built, touched the infant's cheek. The baby's eyes opened. Dark, clear, focused on nothing and everything. Ancient in the way all newborn eyes are ancient, carrying the accumulated weight of every generation that came before and every generation that would follow, and none of the damage that the world had not yet had time to inflict. Kedrick pulled his hand back. Not because the touch was unwelcome, because the sensation that traveled from his fingertips through his arm and into his chest was so far outside the emotional register of anything the Iron Duke had ever experienced that his body did not have a classification for it, and responded instead with the only honest reaction available. His hand shook. Behind them, to the south, the sky flared orange as something massive caught fire inside the Ashford camp. To the west, the faint sound of marching boots echoed through the mining tunnels, where 2,000 soldiers moved toward an empty fortress they believed they were about to conquer. And between those two forces, in the narrow strip of frozen road where moonlight met shadow, a man who had spent his life destroying everything he touched stood before the woman and child he had nearly destroyed and faced the one battle that no amount of military precision, political strategy, or iron will could win for him. Serafina's eyes searched his face, reading the damage, measuring the distance between who he had been and whatever stood before her now, calculating whether the man who locked her in the snow was the same man who stood in front of her bleeding, shaking, reaching toward a child he had almost killed through the sheer gravitational force of his own dysfunction. "Take the documents," she said again, quieter this time. "Save the Empire. Then come back and decide what kind of father you want to be." Kedrick took the documents. Their hands touched during the exchange. Serafina's fingers were ice. His were covered in blood. The contact lasted 2 seconds and carried the weight of 3 years of marriage, betrayal, destruction, and the terrifying possibility that something worth saving still existed between the wreckage. He mounted his horse. He turned south, and at that exact moment, the ground beneath Blackmere Keep shuddered as the first charges detonated along the western wall, and 2,000 soldiers poured through the breach into a fortress that the Duke of Veramont had deliberately abandoned, knowing that the only way to save an empire was to let go of the one thing he had spent his entire life refusing to release: control. The explosion lit the sky behind him. Serafina clutched the baby tighter and pressed herself against the roadside embankment. Kadrick's horse reared. He held it. The animal's hooves came down hard on frozen ground, and he looked back once at the woman standing in the firelight with his son in her arms and the entire world cracking open between them. Then he rode. Into the smoke. Into the chaos. Into the narrow corridor between a collapsing empire and the only chance left to save it. And behind him, standing alone on the road with a newborn pressed against her chest, and the fires of Blackmere painting the sky above her in shades of gold and red and black, Serafina Veramont watched him go and felt something shift inside her that she had been certain was dead. Not love. Not yet. Not the same shape it had been before. Something newer. Something that had been forged in the same fire that was now consuming the fortress where it began. The ground shook again. The baby screamed. The sky burned. And the distance between them grew with every hoofbeat until Kadrick disappeared into the smoke, and Serafina was left alone with the sound of war and the weight of a child and the impossible, terrifying, undeniable truth that the man riding away from her was no longer the man who had locked her in the cold. He was someone she did not recognize yet, and she was not sure whether that made everything better or infinitely more dangerous. Kadrick rode through smoke so thick it turned the night sky into a solid wall of black and orange. The horse beneath him was running on fear now, not strength, its muscles shaking with each stride as burning debris rained across the road from the direction of Blackmere Keep. Behind him, the fortress he had abandoned glowed against the horizon like a fallen star. Ahead, the southern road stretched into darkness toward the imperial garrison at Ashenmere, where the only tribunal with enough authority to dismantle Evelise's network waited behind walls he was not certain would open for a duke whose empire was currently on fire. The documents pressed against his ribs beneath the armor. Serafina's documents. The evidence she had nearly died to retrieve. The evidence she had carried through 4 days of frozen wilderness, through a premature birth, through a crossbow ambush that took Cassian down 6 miles north of the road, where Kadrick now rode alone with nothing between him and the council except 70 miles of winter landscape and the accumulated consequences of every choice he had made for the past 3 years. He rode through the night, through the dawn, through a second night that blurred into the first until time itself became a measurement that no longer corresponded to anything except the distance between hoofbeats. The horse collapsed 12 miles from Ashenmere. Kadrick walked the remaining distance on foot, arriving at the garrison gates as the third dawn broke across the eastern mountains in bands of pale gold that looked like the kind of light that only appeared after storms severe enough to rearrange the sky. The garrison commander was a man named Braddock, 60 years old, built like a wardrobe made of leather and scar tissue. He had served under Serafina's father decades ago and carried the particular brand of loyalty that outlasted political restructuring, dynastic shifts, and the systematic erasure of every alliance that preceded the Veramont consolidation. Braddock looked at Kadrick standing in his courtyard, the Duke of Veramont, unarmored, blood-stained, alone, holding a bundle of documents against his chest the way a man holds the only piece of wreckage that survived a shipwreck. "You look like something the battlefield spit out," Braddock said. "The battlefield spit out the entire Northern Empire. I need the Imperial Council convened for an emergency tribunal." The council does not convene on the request of a duke whose territory is currently being dismantled by a civil war he started. I did not start this war. You created the conditions for it. That is the same thing to men who count bodies for a living. Kadrick held out the documents. His hand was steady. It surprised him. After everything, after the collapse and the battle and the night ride and the walk through frozen country that should have broken his body the way the past week had broken everything else, his hand did not shake. These are treasury records, military contracts, and personal correspondence documenting a 3-year conspiracy by the Arden family to engineer civil war across the northern territories. The conspiracy involved the systematic infiltration of my household staff, the manipulation of trade routes to create artificial shortages, and the redirection of military supplies to coalition forces aligned against my house. Every document bears verifiable seals, dates, and signatures. If the council reviews this evidence and finds it insufficient, I will accept whatever judgment follows. But if this evidence is buried because a garrison commander decided the man carrying it was too damaged to deserve a hearing, then you are not protecting the Empire. You are finishing what Evelis Arden started. Braddock took the documents. He did not open them immediately. He studied Keedrick's face with the practiced scrutiny of a man who had spent 40 years evaluating whether the person standing in front of him was worth trusting with anything sharper than a bread knife. Your wife passed through my intelligence network 3 days ago, Braddock said. Field reports from the Northern Patrols. A woman matching her description, traveling with a military officer and an infant moving south toward Blackmere. She made it. She made it because she is considerably more resilient than anyone in your court gave her credit for, including you. The statement landed without softness. Braddock did not deal in diplomacy. He dealt in assessments, and his assessment of the Duke of Vermont was clearly not favorable. I know what I did, Keedrick said. Do you? Because in my experience, men who destroy the people closest to them rarely understand the full scope of what they have done. They understand the headline, the dramatic failure, the moment of crisis. What they miss is the quiet damage, the daily erosion, the slow grinding work of convincing someone who loves you that their love is a liability. Keedrick said nothing. The courtyard was silent except for wind moving through the garrison walls and the distant sound of horses being fed in the stables. I will convene the council, Braddock said, not for you, for her. Because the woman who carried this evidence through conditions that would have killed most soldiers deserves to have it heard by men with the authority to act on it. He turned and walked inside. Keedrick stood in the courtyard alone. The morning light climbed the garrison walls and touched his face with warmth that felt foreign after days of cold, smoke, and darkness. He closed his eyes. The exhaustion hit him then, all at once, the accumulated weight of everything he had been carrying since the night he condemned Serafina, crashing through the adrenaline barriers that had kept him upright and moving and functional long past the point where his body had any right to continue operating. He sat down on the courtyard stones, and for the first time since he was 9 years old, watching his mother walk through the gates of the Vermont estate and disappear into a life that no longer included him, Keedrick let the weight settle without trying to lift it. The Imperial Council convened 4 days later inside the great chamber of Ashenmere Garrison. 11 men seated behind a curved oak table that had been used for military tribunals since the founding of the Empire. Keedrick stood before them wearing borrowed clothing because his armor had been stripped and catalogued as evidence, and his own wardrobe existed inside a fortress currently occupied by the remnants of an enemy force that had already begun to realize they were holding a prize with no supply line and no strategic value. The documents spoke for themselves. Treasury seals verified by Imperial archivists. Military contracts cross-referenced against garrison deployment records. Evelis's personal correspondence analyzed by 3 independent linguistic assessors who confirmed authorship with a certainty that left no room for legal challenge. The council deliberated for 6 hours. When they emerged, the ruling was comprehensive. The Arden family's assets were seized across every province. Arrest warrants were issued for 7 noble houses that had participated in the coalition conspiracy. Lord Ashford's testimony, extracted by Keedrick on the battlefield and corroborated by captured officers, provided the connective tissue that linked individual acts of treason into a coordinated campaign of imperial destabilization. Evelis Arden was sentenced in absentia to permanent exile and the dissolution of her family's hereditary titles. When garrison forces finally entered Blackmere Keep to extract her from the eastern tower where Keedrick had confined her, they found the chamber empty. A servant's uniform was missing from the laundry stores. A horse was gone from the stables. She was never found. Keedrick received the news of her disappearance while standing in Braddock's office. He read the dispatch twice, folded it, and set it on the desk. She will surface, Braddock said. Women like that do not disappear. They relocate. I know. Does that concern you? Keedrick thought about the question, not the strategic implications. Not the security risk assessment, not the military calculus of an adversary operating without resources or institutional support. He thought about the woman who had sat in his bed for 3 years and studied him the way an engineer studies a structure before demolishing it, who had found every crack, every stress point, every load-bearing weakness in his personality and applied precisely calibrated pressure until the building came down. She was right about one thing, he said. She told me I was the architect of my own destruction. She did not create the flaws she exploited. She simply used the ones I refused to address. That is an unusually honest assessment for a man in your position. My position is a duke standing in a borrowed shirt in someone else's garrison while his fortress smolders 60 miles north. Honesty is the only currency I have left. Braddock studied him for a moment. Then he did something Kaedric did not expect. He reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a sealed letter, and placed it on the surface between them. This arrived yesterday, from the Northern Road. A field courier delivered it under military escort. The handwriting on the seal was Seraphina's. Kaedric picked up the letter. The paper was rough, travel-stained, creased in places where it had been folded and refolded. He opened it and read the contents in silence, while Braddock watched from across the desk with the neutral expression of a man who understood that some moments required witnesses, but not commentary. The letter was short. Seraphina's language had always been economical. She wrote the way she spoke, direct, undecorated, carrying the weight of meaning in what she chose not to say as much as in the words she committed to paper. She was alive. The child was alive. Cassian had been recovered by a northern patrol and was receiving medical treatment at a border outpost. His shoulder would heal. His career would not. A captain who fled with a duke's wife, regardless of the reason, did not return to command. She did not ask about the tribunal. She did not ask about Evelys. She asked one question, a single line at the bottom of the page that Kaedric read 3 times because each reading opened something inside his chest that he did not have the vocabulary to describe. She asked if he wanted to meet his son. Kaedric folded the letter, held it against his thigh with one hand, stared at the wall behind Braddock's desk where a map of the Northern Territories hung with pins marking garrison positions and supply routes and all the physical infrastructure of an empire that existed on paper and would need to be rebuilt from the ground up in reality. "Where is she?" he asked. "The monastery village of Dunhaven, 20 miles north of here. She arrived 2 days ago with the child and has been receiving medical attention from the village physician." "I need a horse." "You need considerably more than a horse. You need a bath, a proper meal, and approximately 48 hours of sleep. But I suspect none of those things are going to happen before you ride north, so take the gray mare in the eastern stable. She is old, but she does not quit." Kaedric rode north. The landscape had changed during the days he spent inside the garrison. The snow was melting. Not dramatically. Not the sudden thaw of early spring. Just the slow, reluctant retreat of winter easing its grip on the ground, the way a fist unclenches after being held tight for so long the muscles have forgotten any other shape. Water ran in thin streams alongside the road. The air smelled different, wet earth, rotting leaves. The particular metallic freshness that preceded seasonal transition, like the first breath after a long time spent holding one. He reached Dunhaven at sunset. The village was small, 30 structures built from local stone with thatched roofs and narrow streets that wound between buildings with the organic, unplanned geometry of a community that grew according to need rather than design. Smoke rose from chimneys, the sound of livestock carried from behind the buildings. A dog barked somewhere. A child laughed somewhere else. Normal sounds. The sounds of people living the kinds of lives that existed beneath the notice of dukes and empires and the geopolitical machinery that Kaedric had spent his entire adult life operating. He found the physician's house at the village center, dismounted, stood outside the door for a long time without knocking. The sunset painted the stone wall beside him in shades of amber and rust, and the deep bruised purple that appeared along the horizon only during the transition between seasons. He was afraid. Not the strategic anxiety of a man calculating risks. Not the controlled tension of a commander preparing for engagement. Physical fear. The kind that lived in the stomach and radiated outward through the extremities until hands shook and breathing shortened and the body's entire nervous system communicated a single unified message. Whatever is behind this door will change everything, and you cannot control what it changes into. He knocked. The door opened. An elderly man with kind eyes and flour on his apron looked at Kaedric with the completely unimpressed expression of a village physician who had been delivering babies and setting bones for 40 years and had no particular reverence for aristocratic titles. "She is in the back room," the physician said. "The child is feeding. If you are the Duke, she told me to tell you that you should come inside and sit down and not say anything stupid." Kaedric almost laughed. The sound did not make it out of his chest, but it moved somewhere behind his ribs like a muscle being used for the first time after a long period of atrophy. He walked through the small house. Stone floors, low ceilings, the smell of dried herbs and boiled linen, and the particular warmth that came from a space where someone had been taking care of other people for a very long time. Serafina sat in a wooden chair beside a narrow window. The evening light came through the glass and touched her face with the same amber tones that colored the walls outside. She looked different, not the dramatic transformation that stories imposed on moments of reunion. Subtler, deeper. The exhaustion remained, the hollows beneath her eyes, the cracked skin along her lips, the way her body held itself with the careful economy of someone who had pushed past physical limits and was now rebuilding from the inside out, one careful movement at a time. The baby slept against her chest, small, impossibly small, wrapped in clean cloth with one fist visible, curled beside his cheek, in the universal posture of an infant who had not yet learned that fists were meant for anything other than holding on to the nearest available surface. Kedrick stopped in the doorway. Serafina looked at him, not with warmth, not with anger, with the measured assessment of a woman who had survived things that should have killed her and was now evaluating whether the man standing in front of her had changed enough to be allowed into the same room as the child he had nearly destroyed through the mechanical application of his own dysfunction. "You look terrible," she said. "I walked 12 miles in armor and then rode 70 more on a borrowed horse. I gave birth in a forest during a blizzard and then rode 40 miles with a crossbow wound healing 6 feet behind me. Your sympathy window is narrow." Kedrick took one step into the room. Then he stopped, waiting. Because entering the space where his wife sat holding his child was no longer something he believed he had the right to do without permission. Serafina watched him stop. Something shifted in her expression. Not forgiveness. Something that preceded forgiveness the way foundation work precedes construction. The recognition that the man standing before her understood, at a structural level, that his presence in this room was not guaranteed by title or marriage or bloodline, but by a choice she had not yet made and might never make if the evidence did not support it. "Sit down," she said. He sat, on a stool near the far wall, 6 feet away from her, close enough to see the baby's face, far enough to communicate that he understood the distance between them was not physical. "The council ruled in our favor," he said. "The Arden assets are seized. 7 houses are under arrest. The conspiracy is documented and entered into the imperial record." "I know. Braddock sent a courier. Evelise escaped." "I know that too." Silence. The kind that existed between two people who had an enormous amount to say and no language capable of carrying it. "His name," Kedrick said. "Does he have a name?" Serafina looked down at the sleeping infant. Her hand adjusted the cloth around his shoulder with the unconscious precision of a mother whose body had already memorized every dimension and temperature requirement of the life she was responsible for. "I have been calling him Edric. That was my grandfather's name." "I know." Kedrick stared at the child, at the small face that carried features he recognized. The jaw, the forehead, the particular set of the brow that, even in an infant too young to frown, already suggested a personality that would not be easily moved by external forces. "I locked you in the snow," he said. The words came out without preparation, without diplomatic framing, without any of the linguistic architecture that Kedrick Veramont had spent a lifetime constructing around every statement to ensure maximum control over its impact. "I locked you in the snow while you carried him. I put another woman in our bed. I condemned you without evidence. I sent cavalry to hunt you. I nearly killed both of you through the absolute certainty that my judgment was infallible and that anyone who challenged it was an enemy." Serafina did not look at him. She looked at the window. The sunset was fading now, the amber turning to ash gray as evening claimed the village. "I know what you did, Kedrick. I need you to know that I understand what I did. Not just the events, the pattern, the architecture. The way I built a version of myself that was incapable of distinguishing between strength and cruelty, because admitting the difference would have required questioning whether every decision I ever made was driven by strategy or by the fear that without absolute control, I would become the kind of man my father discarded. Irrelevant. Disposable. He paused. His breathing was audible in the small room, each exhale carrying the weight of words being spoken for the first time by a man who had spent 3 decades communicating exclusively through orders, negotiations, and the calculated distribution of power. My mother left when I was 9. She walked out the gates, and my father never spoke her name again. I spent 25 years believing she left because she was weak, because she could not survive inside a world that required strength above everything else. It took losing you to understand that she left because she was the strongest person in that fortress. Because staying would have required becoming something she refused to become, and leaving was the only act of defiance available to someone trapped inside a system that punished defiance with destruction. Serafina turned her head. Not all the way. Just enough to see him in her peripheral vision. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes glistened but did not overflow. The control was deliberate. Not the cold control of someone suppressing emotion, but the hard-earned control of someone who had decided that this moment would not be hijacked by tears when clarity was more important than catharsis. You destroyed 3 years of work, she said. The grain routes, the village protections, the orphanage funding across the northern provinces. All of it collapsed when you locked me in that courtyard. Not because I was gone. Because the people I worked with saw the Duke of Veramont throw away the one person who was building something worth protecting, and they understood that nothing they built would survive either. I know. Do you? Because rebuilding infrastructure takes years. Rebuilding trust takes longer. And rebuilding a marriage that was shattered by the kind of betrayal you committed takes something I am not certain you possess. What? Serafina finally met his eyes. Full contact. The gaze was steady, unflinching, carrying the compressed weight of everything she had survived since the night he condemned her. Patience. The willingness to show up every single day and demonstrate through action, not words, not promises, not grand gestures, that the man who did those things no longer exists. And the humility to accept that I might watch you demonstrate it for months or years and still decide it is not enough. Kadric held her gaze. The sunset had faded completely now. The room was lit only by a single oil lamp on the physician's table, throwing warm, unsteady light across the walls and ceiling, and the two people sitting 6 feet apart with a sleeping infant between them and the ruins of everything they had been to each other settling like ash around their feet. I will be here, he said, every day, for as long as you need to decide. That might be forever. Then I will be here forever. Serafina studied his face the way she had studied it on the night they first met, when a political marriage between 2 powerful houses had placed her across a dinner table from a man whose reputation preceded him like a weather system, and whose eyes, when they finally met hers, carried something that contradicted every story she had been told about the Iron Duke. Something uncertain, something searching, something that looked like a man standing inside a fortress he had built around himself, and wondering for the first time whether the walls were protecting him or trapping him. She had seen it then. She saw it now. The same uncertainty, but different, older, earned through damage rather than instinct. The uncertainty of a man who had dismantled his own walls and was standing in the open for the first time, exposed to weather he had spent his entire life engineering systems to avoid. Sit closer, she said. He moved the stool forward, 3 feet, close enough to smell the clean linen wrapped around the baby, close enough to see the pulse beating in Serafina's throat. Closer. He moved again, 1 foot, his knee nearly touching hers. Serafina lifted the sleeping infant from her chest. The baby stirred. His dark eyes opened briefly, unfocused, scanning the dim room with the profound disinterest of a creature who had not yet developed the capacity for judgment, and therefore experienced every face as simply another surface in a world made entirely of surfaces. She placed the child into Kadric's arms. The weight was nothing. 5 pounds. Maybe 6. The weight of a sword hilt, the weight of a diplomatic seal, the weight of things Kadric had held 1,000 times without thinking. But this weight was different. This weight rearranged something inside his chest that had been locked in the wrong position for 34 years. Not a dramatic shift, not the cinematic transformation that stories imposed on moments like this. Something quieter. something that felt like a bone being set after a very long time spent broken. The pain of realignment, the relief of geometry returning to its intended configuration. Edric's hand found Kaedric's finger. The grip was automatic, involuntary. The reflexive closure of an infant's fist around the nearest available object. But the object was his father's hand, and the grip, impossibly small and impossibly strong at the same time, held on with the blind, absolute certainty that whatever it had found was worth keeping. Kaedric looked down at his son. The lamplight softened the hard lines of his face and filled the hollows beneath his eyes with warm shadow that made him look less like a duke and more like a man holding a child in a small room at the end of a very long day. "He does not know what I am," Kaedric said quietly. "No, he does not. He does not know what I did. He will. Eventually. Children learn the shape of their parents whether you tell them or not. They read it in the way you hold things, the way you respond when something breaks, the way you handle the gap between the person you want to be and the person you actually are." Kaedric looked at Seraphina. The distance between them had been reduced to inches, but the space it contained was still vast, still populated by wreckage and consequence, and the accumulated cost of every moment he had chosen power over the woman sitting beside him. "I do not know how to be what he needs," he said. "Neither do I. That is the entire point. You learn it while you are doing it, and you fail at it regularly, and you come back the next morning and try again with whatever you learned from failing." That sounds terrifying. It is. It is the most terrifying thing you will ever do. More than any battlefield, more than any siege. Because on a battlefield, the worst thing that can happen is you die. With a child, the worst thing that can happen is you survive long enough to damage them the way you were damaged, and then you watch it happen and know exactly where it came from. Kaedric held the baby against his chest. Edric's breathing was steady, small. The rhythm of lungs that had only been working for days and had already established a pattern as reliable as a heartbeat. In and out, in and out. The fundamental machinery of a life that had not yet been complicated by strategy, ambition, fear, or the thousand mechanisms that adults built around themselves to avoid the vulnerability of simply being alive in a world that offered no guarantees. "I will not be my father," Kaedric said. "You already were your father. For 3 years. The question is not whether you will become him. The question is whether you can stay the man who walked into this room tonight long enough for it to become permanent." Seraphina reached out and touched the back of his hand, the hand holding their son. Her fingers rested against his knuckles, against the scar tissue and the calluses and the evidence of a life spent gripping things too tightly because the alternative was losing them entirely. "I do not forgive you yet," she said. "I know. I may not forgive you for a very long time. I know that too. But I am willing to watch you try. Not for you, for him. Because he deserves a father who stayed and fought through the wreckage, instead of a father who gave up when forgiveness did not come fast enough." Kaedric nodded. The motion was small, contained. The nod of a man who understood that the agreement he was making was not a single decision, but a daily commitment that would be tested every morning when he woke up and discovered that the person he had been the day before was not quite sufficient, and the person he needed to become required another increment of change that felt like pulling a tooth from his own jaw without anything to numb the pain. Seraphina leaned her shoulder against his. Not an embrace, not the romantic reunion that the story of a duke and duchess might have demanded. Something more honest. The physical contact of two people who had survived the same catastrophe and were sitting together in the rubble, not because the rubble had been cleared, but because clearing it was going to take a very long time, and doing it alone was no longer an option either of them was willing to choose. The lamp flickered. The wind pressed against the small house. Somewhere outside, the last light of sunset disappeared behind the western mountains, and the first stars appeared in a sky that had been hidden behind storm clouds for weeks, and was now, slowly, reluctantly, beginning to clear. Months passed. Blackmere Keep was rebuilt stone by stone. The western wall that Evelisa's engineers had breached was reinforced with double-thickness masonry and a defensive architecture designed by military engineers who understood that the greatest threat to any fortress was not the enemy outside but the vulnerabilities inside. The burned towers were reconstructed. The Great Hall was restored. The portraits of dead Vermont dukes were rehung along walls that smelled of fresh plaster and new timber. But the fortress that emerged from the reconstruction was not the same Blackmere that had stood before the war. The eastern courtyard where Serafina had stood barefoot in the snow was converted into a garden. The underground tunnels where she had found the evidence that saved the empire were opened to public access and transformed into archive chambers with transparent record-keeping systems that any citizen could audit. The master chamber where Eveless had poured wine beside the Duke's fire was dismantled entirely and rebuilt as a family residence with windows large enough to let in sunlight that the original design had deliberately excluded. Ceadric reformed the Northern Territories with the same systematic precision he had once applied to military conquest, except the targets were different now. Corrupt tax systems were replaced with accountable governance structures. Military tribunals were open to public observation. Land redistribution programs returned stolen property to families that had been dispossessed during the Arden conspiracy. Cassian Vale, recovered from his crossbow wound and cleared of all charges by the Imperial Council, was reinstated as captain of the Household Guard with expanded authority to oversee internal security reforms. Many aristocrats in the Northern Territories called the changes weakness. They whispered that the Iron Duke had gone soft, that losing his wife and nearly losing his empire had broken something inside him that could not be repaired. The people who lived inside those territories said something different. They said the Duke had finally become the kind of ruler who understood that an empire built on fear produced subjects who waited for the first opportunity to revolt, while an empire built on accountability produced citizens who defended the system because the system defended them. Serafina resumed her work across the provinces. The grain routes reopened. The village protection networks were reestablished. The orphanage funding was restored and expanded with treasury allocations that Ceadric authorized without negotiation or condition. She did not move back into the master chamber. She maintained separate quarters in the eastern wing for 4 months, while Ceadric demonstrated, through daily action rather than declaration, that the man who had locked her in the cold no longer existed inside the body, walking through their shared corridors. He attended every provincial meeting she organized. He reviewed every infrastructure proposal she submitted. He stood beside her during public assemblies and deferred to her expertise on domestic governance with the straightforward acknowledgement of a man who had learned, at tremendous cost, that surrounding yourself with people who were better than you at certain things was not weakness, but the only form of leadership that produced anything worth preserving. On a quiet evening in late spring, when the snow had finally melted from Blackmere's towers, and the northern fields were beginning to show the first green growth of a season that felt more earned than any harvest in living memory, Serafina walked into Ceadric's study without knocking. He looked up from the desk where he was reviewing provincial tax reforms. His face had changed over the months. Not softer exactly, still carrying the scar along the jaw and the hard architecture of a man who had been built for conflict. But the eyes were different, less guarded, less calculated, carrying a quality that had not been there before the war, and that could not have arrived through any mechanism other than the slow, painful process of living alongside the consequences of his worst decisions and choosing, every morning, to remain present inside the discomfort rather than retreating into the iron shell that had once made him untouchable and alone. "Edric smiled today," Serafina said. Smiled or had gas? Smiled. Full facial involvement, directed specifically at the wooden horse you carved for him last week. The horse with the crooked legs. He does not appear to have your standards for craftsmanship. Ceadric set down his pen. Something moved across his face that had been appearing more frequently in recent weeks. Not the mechanical, almost smile that had characterized his early attempts at emotional expression. Something genuine. Something that started behind the eyes and traveled outward through the facial muscles with the uncontrolled, slightly awkward quality of a man relearning how to use equipment that had been in storage for decades. "Show me," he said. They walked together to the nursery. The corridors of Blackmere were lit with evening light that came through the new windows and turned the stone walls to warm gold. Servants passed them and nodded with the easy familiarity of staff who had grown accustomed to seeing the Duke and Duchess walk side by side through their own home without the rigid formality that once governed every interaction inside these walls. Edric was awake in his crib, dark eyes open. one fist wrapped around the wooden horse with the crooked legs, holding it against his chest with the absolute conviction that this object was the most important thing in the known universe. Kedrick reached down and lifted his son. The motion had become practiced over months of repetition, losing the stiff awkwardness of those early days in Dunhaven when holding a child felt like operating unfamiliar machinery and gaining instead the fluid, unconscious confidence of a man who had done this enough times that his body no longer needed his mind's permission to perform it correctly. Edric looked at his father. Then he smiled. Not gas, the real thing. A full, open-faced expression of uncomplicated recognition directed at the man holding him. The smile of a child who had not yet learned to calculate the cost of vulnerability and therefore offered trust the way sunlight offered warmth, without condition, without strategy, without the elaborate protective infrastructure that adults constructed around every emotional exchange to ensure they could never be hurt by the same person twice. Kedrick looked at that smile and felt the last remaining wall inside his chest collapse. Not dramatically, not with the violent internal demolition of the night in the war chamber when the Iron Duke had died. Quietly, the way a structure comes down when someone carefully removes the final supporting beam and allows the weight to settle into a new configuration that no longer requires walls because the thing being protected no longer needs protection. Serafina stood beside him. She watched him hold their son and saw in his face the evidence of something she had spent 4 months evaluating with the careful, unforgiving scrutiny of a woman who understood that transformation was not a single event, but a sustained commitment that could fail at any moment and needed to be verified through accumulation rather than declaration. She placed her hand on his arm. Not his hand. His arm. The place where muscle met bone and the physical machinery of the man she had married was most visible. The place where strength lived. The Empire feared the Iron Duke, she said quietly. Kedrick looked at her. The evening light caught his face and Serafina's hand on his arm, and the baby smiling between them with the crooked wooden horse pressed against his chest. But our son deserves a father. Kedrick held the boy closer. The weight against his chest was still nothing. 5 pounds. 6. The weight of a world that had been rebuilt from wreckage and was held together not by iron or force or the mechanical application of absolute authority, but by the daily, unglamorous, terrifying commitment to remain present inside a life that offered no guarantees except the certainty that showing up mattered more than winning. Beyond the window, the last light of spring settled across the northern territories. Fields of green stretched toward mountains that still carried snow on their peaks. The distant sound of village life drifted up from the valley below Blackmere Keep. Laughter, commerce. The ordinary music of people going about their lives inside an empire that had survived its own self-destruction and emerged, not triumphant, not perfected, but standing. The bells of Blackmere rang across the evening air, not for war, not for power, not for the arrival of armies or the declaration of conquests or any of the occasions that had prompted those bells to sound throughout the violent, magnificent, deeply damaged history of House Veramont. They rang because it was evening, because the day was ending, because somewhere inside the rebuilt fortress, a man who had spent his life mistaking control for strength was holding his son while the woman he had nearly destroyed stood beside him with her hand on his arm, and the first real peace either of them had known settling across their shoulders like warmth after a very long winter. And that was enough. Not perfect, not healed, but enough.